They say betrayal tastes like champagne and roses, until you're the one choking on it. Empress Seraphina Vale learned that lesson the hardest way possible, standing in a ballroom full of diamonds and liars, watching her husband kiss the woman she called sister. Tonight, you're going to witness how a queen dies and a monster is born. This isn't your typical revenge fantasy. This is war painted in silk and blood. Stick around until the very end because what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, love, and survival. If this story gets your blood pumping, smash that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let's build this tribe together. Seraphina's fingers were trembling against the gold railing of the imperial balcony, but she refused to let anyone see. Below her, the winter banquet sprawled across the grand hall like a living, breathing serpent, all glittering scales and hidden venom. 2,000 nobles packed into a space designed for elegance, their laughter echoing off marble columns that had witnessed 3 centuries of lies. She'd spent 6 hours getting ready for this night. 6 hours of servants pulling her corset so tight she could barely breathe, pinning jewels into her dark hair until her scalp ached, painting her face into a mask of imperial perfection. The emerald gown they'd sewn for her cost more than most families earned in a decade. It was supposed to make her look powerful. Instead, she felt like a dressed-up corpse. Seraphina's maid, an older woman named Celeste who'd served her since childhood, had noticed her hand shaking while fastening the final clasp of her diamond necklace. The woman had said nothing, but her eyes held a warning Seraphina was too naive to read. Now, standing above the celebration meant to honor her 7th year as empress, Seraphina finally understood what that look meant. Her husband was late. Again, Emperor Lucian Draven was supposed to arrive an hour ago to open the banquet with her. It was tradition, the emperor and empress descending the grand staircase together while the court bowed low, a display of unity that reinforced the divine right of their rule. But Lucian's chair sat empty beside hers on the dais, and the nobles were beginning to whisper. Lady Merida Ashton appeared at her elbow, like a ghost materializing from smoke. She wore silver tonight, a dress that clung to curves Seraphina no longer possessed after 2 miscarriages had hollowed her out from the inside. Merida's smile was warm, concerned, perfect. Everything about Merida was perfect. He's probably just delayed with military matters, Merida said softly, placing a hand on Seraphina's bare shoulder. Her touch was cold. You know how Lucian gets when the northern territories send reports. Seraphina wanted to believe her. God, she wanted to believe her best friend, the woman who'd held her through both pregnancy losses, who'd sat with her during the long nights when Lucian's absence carved holes in her chest. He promised, Seraphina whispered. He swore he'd be here tonight. Merida's expression flickered, something fast and hungry that vanished before Seraphina could name it. Men promise many things, darling. We love them anyway. The words felt wrong, like a key turning in a lock Seraphina didn't know existed. Below them, the massive oak doors at the hall's entrance swung open with a boom that silenced 2,000 conversations. Emperor Lucian Draven strode in, and Seraphina's heart lurched with relief so powerful it almost knocked her sideways. He was magnificent. 6 feet 4 inches of controlled power wrapped in black military dress, adorned with gold thread and the crimson sash of imperial authority. His dark hair was swept back from a face women wrote poetry about, sharp jaw, storm gray eyes, a mouth that could command armies, or whisper promises that felt like prayer. Seraphina had fallen in love with that face when she was 17 years old. 10 years later, she still felt like that girl sometimes. Desperate and foolish and so hungry for his attention she'd carved herself into whatever shape he needed. She moved toward the stairs, ready to descend and meet him, to salvage this disaster of a delayed entrance with grace, and the practiced smile she'd perfected over 7 years of being watched. Then Lucian turned his head, and Seraphina's world began its slow, inevitable collapse. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at someone in the crowd, and his expression held something she recognized because she'd spent a decade searching for it in his eyes when he looked at her. Tenderness. Real, unguarded tenderness. Seraphina followed his gaze through the sea of nobles and landed on Merida, who'd somehow descended from the balcony without her noticing. Her best friend stood at the base of the grand staircase, silver dress catching the light from 1,000 candles, And the smile on her face wasn't the one she wore for Serafina. It was intimate, knowing, triumphant. Time did something strange then. It stretched and compressed simultaneously, turning seconds into hours while Serafina's mind tried frantically to reshape what she was seeing into something innocent. Maybe Lucienne was just being polite. Maybe she was misreading the situation. Maybe the champagne she'd nervously sipped earlier was making her paranoid. Then Lucien crossed the hall in long strides that parted the crowd like a blade through silk, and he took Merida's hand and brought it to his lips in a gesture so tender, so careful, that Serafina felt something crack behind her sternum. The whispers started immediately. 2,000 nobles who'd learned to read a room the way sharks smell blood in water, all turning their heads in synchronized curiosity toward the balcony where the Empress stood frozen. Celeste appeared at Serafina's side, gripping her arm with surprising strength. "Your Majesty, we should retire. You're not feeling well. Food poisoning from lunch?" "No." Serafina's voice came out steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "I'm fine." She wasn't fine. She was watching her husband kiss her best friend's knuckles while maintaining eye contact with the heat that Serafina had spent 7 years trying to ignite in him. She was feeling the sympathetic stares of 2,000 people who'd known something she hadn't, who'd probably been laughing behind jeweled fans about the stupid empress who couldn't see what was happening in her own palace. But she'd learned something crucial during 7 years of imperial training: never show weakness in front of predators. Serafina descended the grand staircase alone, every step measured and controlled despite her legs feeling like water. Her emerald dress whispered against marble, the train spreading behind her like spilled blood. She'd practiced this walk 10,000 times, spine straight, chin lifted, eyes forward. The Empress's walk. The walk of a woman who commanded nations. It had never felt more like a lie. The crowd parted for her, and Serafina could taste their anticipation like copper on her tongue. They wanted drama. They wanted to see the perfect Empress crack, to watch the Empire's jewel shatter across polished floors. She'd rather die. Lucien finally noticed her approaching, and his hand dropped from Merida's like she'd burned him. Guilt flashed across his face, there and gone in a heartbeat, before his imperial mask slammed back into place. Cold. Distant. The expression he usually reserved for incompetent council members and foreign ambassadors he was about to destroy in negotiations. Serafina. Her name in his mouth sounded like an accusation. "I apologize for my lateness. Border disputes required immediate attention." She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the lie in his eyes, far enough to maintain the illusion of dignity. Up close, she could smell Merida's jasmine perfume clinging to his uniform collar. How long had this been happening? How many nights had Lucien claimed to be working late in his study while Serafina paced their empty bedroom, wondering what she'd done wrong this time? How many state dinners had Merida sat beside her, squeezing her hand in sympathy, while secretly counting the hours until she could crawl into the Emperor's bed? "Of course," Serafina heard herself say, her voice carrying across the silent hall with practiced clarity. "The Empire comes first, it always does." The emphasis on empire was deliberate, a reminder that he'd married her not for love, but for political alliance. Her family controlled the southern territories and 3 major trading ports. The marriage had been strategic, beneficial, necessary. She'd known that going in. She just hadn't expected to actually fall in love with him. That had been her first mistake. Lucien's jaw tightened. "Shall we begin the banquet? Our guests are waiting." Merida stood slightly behind him, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his arm. She'd stopped smiling, but her eyes held something worse than triumph: pity. Serafina wanted to rip those pitying eyes out of her perfect face. Instead, she inclined her head graciously and offered her arm to her husband, forcing him to take it or cause a scene. His hand closed around her elbow with all the warmth of a corpse, and together they moved toward the head table while musicians scrambled to strike up the imperial anthem. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in torture disguised as celebration. Serafina sat at the center of the head table with Lucien on her right, and because fate had a sick sense of humor, Merida seated directly across from them as the evening's guest of honor. Apparently, Merida had recently been appointed as the new ambassador of cultural affairs, a position that gave her unlimited access to the palace and the emperor. How convenient. Course after course arrived. Roasted pheasant, herb-crusted lamb, delicate pastries that tasted like ash in Serafina's mouth. She smiled through every bite, laughed at the appropriate moments, played her role flawlessly while dying inside. She watched them. She couldn't help it. Every stolen glance between Lucien and Merida felt like a knife between her ribs. The way his fingers drummed against the table matched the rhythm of Merida's breathing. The way they both reached for wine at the exact same moment. Small intimacies that spoke of hours spent together, of inside jokes and shared secrets. A relationship built in the shadows of Serafina's trust. Lord Castellan, the ancient master of coin who'd served 3 emperors, leaned toward her during the 4th course. His watery eyes held something she couldn't quite read. "Your Majesty appears troubled," he said quietly. "The lamb disagrees with you, perhaps?" Serafina's mask never cracked. "I'm perfectly well, Lord Castellan. Simply tired. These events can be exhausting." "Indeed." He took a long sip of wine, his gaze drifting toward Lucien and Merida, who were engaged in what looked like a very private conversation despite the 200 people surrounding them. Exhausting and educational. One learned so much at these gatherings about the true nature of loyalty. The emphasis on loyalty sent ice down Serafina's spine. Was he trying to tell her something, or was he simply another vulture circling, waiting to see if she'd break? "Loyalty is the foundation of empire," Serafina replied carefully. "Without it, kingdoms crumble." "Precisely." Lord Castellan's thin lips curved into something that might have been approval. "And those who betray such loyalty often find themselves replaced. History has taught us this lesson repeatedly." Before Serafina could respond, Lucien stood abruptly, silencing the hall with the scrape of his chair against marble. His storm-gray eyes swept the crowd with the cold assessment of a predator surveying prey. "Noble lords and ladies," his voice carried that command of absolute authority that had always made Serafina's heart race. "I thank you for joining us to celebrate another year of prosperity under imperial rule. Tonight, however, I have an announcement that will shape the future of our great empire." Serafina's blood turned to ice water. She hadn't been informed of any announcement. Major declarations were supposed to be discussed with her beforehand. It was protocol, a sign of respect for her position as empress. Lucien's gaze flickered to her for just a moment, and what she saw there stopped her heart. Finality. "As you know," Lucien continued, "an empire is only as strong as the bloodline that leads it. For 7 years, the empress and I have ruled together, united in purpose and duty." Past tense. He was using past tense. Serafina's fingers gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles went white. Around the hall, nobles leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. However, Lucien's voice dropped into a tone that could freeze oceans. "It has become clear that certain arrangements are no longer beneficial to the empire's future. The throne requires an heir, and after much consideration and consultation with the royal council, liar." The word escaped Serafina's mouth before she could stop it, cutting through Lucien's speech like a blade through silk. Absolute silence crashed over the grand hall. 2,000 nobles held their collective breath. Lucien turned to her slowly, his expression a mask of imperial displeasure. "I beg your pardon?" Serafina stood, her chair scraping back with a sound like a scream. 7 years of swallowing rage, of blaming herself for his coldness, of trying desperately to be good enough, all of it burning through her veins like poison turning to fire. "The Royal Council," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "approved no such consultation. I would know. I sit on that council." Lucien's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You've missed the last 6 meetings, Serafina. By choice, if I recall correctly. Because you scheduled them during my charity work in the southern provinces. Work that you encouraged me to undertake." Each word tasted like revelation. He'd been planning this, isolating her systematically, removing her from positions of power while she'd been too busy trying to save their marriage to notice the knife at her back. Merida stood, her beautiful face arranged in false concern. "Sarah, darling, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Don't!" Serafina's voice cracked like a whip, silencing her former friend mid-sentence. "Don't you dare call me that. Don't you dare stand there wearing the silver dress I helped you choose and pretend you give a damn about my feelings. The mask was crumbling now, 7 years of perfect imperial composure disintegrating in real time. Serafina could feel it happening, could feel herself falling apart in front of everyone who mattered, and she couldn't stop. Lucienne moved toward her with the careful approach of someone handling a dangerous animal. "You're overwrought. The stress of your position has clearly—" "How long?" Serafina demanded, backing away from him. "How long have you been fucking her?" Gasps rippled through the hall. The Empress never cursed. The Empress never raised her voice. The Empress was grace and dignity and everything proper. The Empress was dead. 2 years, Merida said quietly, and the simple honesty of it was somehow worse than any lie. She wasn't gloating or defensive. She was just stating a fact. "It started 2 years ago, after your second miscarriage. You were so broken, Sarah. Lucian needed someone who could be strong." The sympathy in her voice made Serafina want to vomit. She'd been grieving the loss of her second child, a daughter who'd lived just long enough for Serafina to hold her before the tiny heart stopped beating, and her husband had been seeking comfort in the arms of her best friend. While Serafina had been shattering, they'd been falling in love. "This is inappropriate." Lord Castellan's voice cut through the chaos, surprisingly firm for a man who looked half dead. "Your Majesty, if you intend to make changes to the imperial succession, there are protocols, legal procedures. The Empress cannot simply be discarded like—" "The Empress," Lucian interrupted, his voice cold as winter steel, "has failed in her primary duty. After 7 years and 2 failures, it's clear she cannot provide an heir. The Empire requires stability, and I have found a woman who can give me sons." There it was, the truth laid bare in front of 2,000 witnesses. Serafina felt something inside her chest simply stop. Not her heart, that kept beating traitorously, pumping blood through a body that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. But something deeper, something that had defined her entire existence for the past decade. Hope died. The naive girl who'd believed in fairy tales and true love and the power of devotion, she died right there on the polished marble floor of the grand hall, surrounded by diamonds and lies. What remained was something colder, sharper, furious. "You planned this," Serafina said, her voice suddenly calm, the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. "This entire evening, the delayed entrance, seating Merida across from us, making your announcement in front of the entire court." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the calculation in his eyes. "You wanted to humiliate me publicly so I'd have no choice but to accept quietly." Lucian's silence was confirmation enough. "And my family?" Serafina continued, pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "The southern territories and trade ports that came with our marriage. What happens to those alliances when you discard me?" "Already handled," Merida said, and her voice held an edge now. The sympathy was gone, replaced by something that looked like impatience. "Your brother Marcus has been quite cooperative. He understands that supporting the Empire's future is more important than family loyalty." Marcus, her younger brother who'd always been jealous of her position, who'd wanted the territorial governorship for himself. They'd bought him off, probably promised him power and wealth in exchange for his silence. Serafina had never felt more alone in her entire life. "The Royal Guard will escort you to your chambers," Lucian said, gesturing to the soldiers lining the walls. "You'll remain there until arrangements can be made for your transition to private life. Your title and assets will be—" "No." The word came out quiet but absolute. Serafina straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and stared down the man who'd shared her bed for 7 years without ever truly seeing her. "You want me gone?" Her voice carried across the silent hall, steady and cold. "Then do it properly. Divorce me before the High Council with legal documentation and just cause. Let me defend myself with evidence and witnesses. Give me the trial I'm entitled to under imperial law." She watched something flicker across Lucien's face. Surprise, maybe. He'd expected her to break, to run crying from the hall in humiliation. He hadn't expected resistance. "Very well," he said finally. "The High Council will convene in 3 days to review the matter of imperial succession and marital dissolution. Until then, you are confined to the East Wing under guard." Serafina nodded once, regal despite the ruins of her life crumbling around her. She turned to leave, her emerald train sweeping behind her like a war banner, and the crowd parted silently. She made it exactly 7 steps before Merida's voice stopped her. "Sarah, wait. Please. I never wanted it to happen like this. I never wanted to hurt you." Serafina turned slowly, and the look on her face made several nobles step back involuntarily. "You're right," she said softly. "You never wanted to hurt me. You just didn't care if you did. There's a difference, and it's the only thing I'll remember about you." She walked away then, spine straight and head high, while 2,000 nobles watched the Empress die. And something else, something dangerous, began to rise from her ashes. The doors closed behind her with a boom like a coffin lid, and Serafina finally allowed herself to collapse against the cold marble wall of the empty corridor beyond. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall in front of anyone. Celeste materialized from the shadows, her weathered face set in grim lines. "Your Majesty, we need to move quickly. There are things you don't know, things I should have told you months ago." "What things?" Serafina's voice came out broken. "The Royal Council meetings you missed? They weren't just discussing your replacement." Celeste glanced down the corridor, checking for listening ears. "They've been systematically removing your family's influence from every position of power. Your cousins dismissed from military commands. Your uncle stripped of his judicial seat. Your father's trade agreements undermined and renegotiated." Ice flooded Serafina's veins. "When did this start?" 18 months ago, right after you returned from grief counseling following the second miscarriage." Celeste's eyes held fury and guilt in equal measure. "They waited until you were at your weakest, then dismantled everything your family built over 3 generations. Why didn't you tell me?" "I tried. You wouldn't hear it. You were so desperate to save your marriage, to believe the Emperor still loved you, that you ignored every warning sign." Celeste gripped Serafina's shoulders hard enough to bruise. "But you're hearing it now. And you need to understand something crucial. The council meeting in 3 days isn't about granting you a fair trial. It's about making your destruction legal." "What do you mean?" "There's a clause in imperial law, rarely invoked, buried so deep most people don't know it exists. If an empress is deemed unfit to rule due to failure to produce an heir, and if the emperor presents evidence of mental instability or incompetence, she can be stripped of title, assets, and even family connections. You become a non-person, erased from imperial history." Serafina's blood ran cold. "Evidence of mental instability. Think about it. Your grief after the miscarriages, your isolated charity work in the provinces, your missed council meetings, every choice you made, every moment of vulnerability. They've been documenting it all, building a case that you're unfit for imperial duties." The full scope of the trap finally revealed itself, and Serafina felt nauseous. This wasn't just about Lucian wanting a new wife. This was about completely destroying her so she could never threaten his power or reclaim her family's influence. They hadn't just betrayed her. They'd been systematically erasing her. 3 days, Serafina whispered. "I have 3 days to gather evidence, build a defense, and somehow survive a rigged trial against the most powerful man in the Empire." "No," Celeste said firmly. "You have 3 days to decide whether you're going to fight like the Empress they think you are, or fight like the woman you're about to become." Serafina stared at her maid, her friend, her only ally in a palace full of vipers, and felt something shift deep inside her chest. The part of her that had spent 7 years trying to be good enough, trying to earn love through perfect behavior and selfless devotion, had died tonight in that ballroom. What remained was rawer, angrier, absolutely done, playing by rules designed to keep her weak. "Tell me everything," Serafina said quietly. "Every betrayal, every conspiracy, every piece of evidence they have against me. I want to know exactly what I'm up against." Celeste smiled grimly. "Now you sound like an empress." They moved through darkened corridors toward the east wing, and Celeste began speaking in low, urgent tones. With each revelation, Serafina's understanding of her situation deepened and darkened. The second miscarriage hadn't been natural. The palace physician who'd attended her, a man she'd trusted completely, had been paid off. Not to kill the baby outright, that would have been too obvious, but to prescribe medications that increased the likelihood of premature labor. Her daughter had never had a chance. The charity work Lucian had encouraged? It had been designed to keep her away from the palace during crucial council votes that redistributed power away from her family's allies. Her brother Marcus's cooperation hadn't been bought with promises alone. They'd threatened to expose his gambling debts and illegal dealings with foreign merchants, debts that Lucien's spies had helped him accumulate through carefully planted opportunities. Every piece of the trap had been laid with precision over 18 months, while Serafina had been too grief-stricken and love-blind to notice. "How do you know all this?" Serafina asked as they finally reached her chambers. "Because I'm not just your maid, Your Majesty. I'm your father's agent. He sent me to watch over you when you first married the Emperor. I've been gathering intelligence on palace activities for years, waiting for the moment I'd need to protect you." Celeste produced a small wooden box from inside her robes. This contains copies of forged documents, intercepted letters, financial records of bribes paid to council members, and testimony from 3 servants who witnessed the Emperor and Lady Merida together. It's not enough to prove your innocence in 3 days, but it's enough to start a very different kind of war. Serafina took the box with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of papers covered in damning evidence, proof that the Emperor had violated imperial law, proof that the council was corrupt, proof that she'd been targeted for destruction. But Celeste was right. 3 days wasn't enough time to present this evidence through proper legal channels. The trial was rigged, the council bought and paid for, her allies systematically removed from positions where they could help her. She couldn't win by playing their game. She'd have to create a new one. "What about the military?" Serafina asked suddenly. "The generals and commanders. Surely they can't all be in Lucian's pocket." The northern generals remain loyal to the old codes of honor. They see Lucien as weak for how he's handled the border disputes. Celeste's eyes gleamed. General Marcus Thorne in particular has been vocal about his disappointment in the Emperor's recent decisions. "He knew your father well, fought beside him during the unification wars." "And you think he'd help me?" "I think he'd help the Empire avoid civil war, which is exactly what will happen if your family's southern territories decide they no longer recognize Lucian's authority." Celeste's smile was sharp. "Your father may be dead, but your uncle still controls 3 major ports and 5,000 troops. If you could prove to him that Lucian violated imperial law and conspired to destroy your family, he'd revolt." Serafina's mind was racing now, seeing connections and possibilities she'd been too naive to recognize before. The southern territories would secede, and the Emperor would have to commit military forces to suppress them. Forces he doesn't have because of the northern border conflicts. Exactly. Which means General Thorne and the northern commanders would have significant leverage. They could demand changes, reforms, even regime change. Serafina looked at the box of evidence in her hands, then at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back at her wore a ruined evening gown and smudged cosmetics, but her eyes held something new. Calculation. "If I do this," Serafina said slowly, "if I start a war within the Empire to save myself, people will die. Soldiers, civilians, families torn apart by conflict. If you don't," Celeste replied without mercy, "you'll be erased, your family destroyed, and Lucien will continue ruling with Merida at his side, becoming more corrupt and more dangerous until someone else finally stops him. You're not starting a war, Your Majesty. You're choosing which war to fight." The weight of that truth settled over Serafina like armor, heavy, uncomfortable, necessary. She thought of every kind word Merida had spoken while plotting her destruction, every cold dismissal from Lucien while he'd been dismantling her family's power, every sympathetic smile from council members who'd voted to erase her existence. They'd taken her trust and weaponized it. They'd taken her love and used it as a leash. They'd taken her grief and turned it into evidence of incompetence. Well, she was done being anyone's victim. "Send word to my uncle in the southern territories," Serafina said, her voice steady and cold. "Tell him what happened tonight. Tell him about the evidence we have. And tell him that his niece requests his counsel on matters of imperial law and family honor." Celeste's smile was fierce. "And General Thorne? Arrange a meeting, somewhere private where we won't be observed. I need to understand the military's position on succession law and martial authority. You're preparing for civil war." "I'm preparing to survive." Serafina turned from the window, and the woman looking back at Celeste was different from the one who'd descended the grand staircase hours earlier. "They think I'm broken. They think I'll accept exile quietly and fade into history as a footnote about a failed empress. And you won't? I'm going to do something much worse." Serafina's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I'm going to become exactly what they always feared I could be." Celeste nodded once, then moved toward the door. "I'll begin making arrangements. But Your Majesty, you should know, once you start down this path, there's no going back. You'll have to become ruthless, cunning, willing to sacrifice anything for victory, including the parts of yourself that made you kind. Good, Seraphina said softly. That woman was too weak to survive. Let her stay dead. After Celeste left, Seraphina stood alone in her chambers surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt like a cage. Through the window, she could see the grand hall still blazing with lights as the banquet continued without her. They were probably celebrating right now, toasting the Emperor's new future with his beautiful new bride. Let them celebrate. Let them think they'd won. Seraphina opened the wooden box and began reading through the evidence, memorizing every detail, planning her next moves with the cold precision of a general preparing for battle. She'd spent 7 years trying to be the perfect empress, the dutiful wife, the gentlewoman who earned love through sacrifice. That version of her had gotten her nothing but betrayal and ruin. Time to try something different. The midnight bells chimed across the palace grounds, marking the end of the winter banquet and the beginning of something much darker. In 3 days, the High Council would convene to destroy her. They had evidence, they had power, they had the Emperor himself on their side. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated her. And before this was over, every single person who'd plotted her downfall would learn a lesson about survival that the Empire would never forget. The most dangerous woman in any room is the one with nothing left to lose. Seraphina Vale, Empress of the Draven Empire, had just been given her death sentence. But empires had burned for less than revenge, and she was just getting started. The candles in Seraphina's chambers burned down to stubs while she worked through the night, her fingers stained with ink as she cataloged every piece of damning evidence Celeste had provided. Outside her window, the palace slowly went dark as the celebration ended, and 2,000 nobles returned to their beds, probably gossiping about the spectacle they'd witnessed. Let them talk. Words were just noise until they became weapons. She'd spread the documents across her writing desk in careful categories. Financial records showing bribes paid to council members, forged medical reports about her supposed mental instability, intercepted letters between Lucian and various conspirators. Each paper represented a thread in the web they'd woven around her, and she was methodically tracing each thread back to its source. The palace physician who'd sabotaged her pregnancy had received 20,000 gold marks deposited into a foreign account 3 weeks before her second miscarriage. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Council member Valerius, who'd always smiled warmly at her during meetings, had voted to strip her family's military appointments while simultaneously receiving a lucrative trade contract that coincidentally benefited his merchant houses. Even her brother Marcus's betrayal had a paper trail, gambling debts at specific establishments owned by shell companies that traced back to imperial coffers. They'd manufactured his desperation, then offered him salvation in exchange for abandoning his sister. Every betrayal had been calculated, purchased, planned. Seraphina's hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. Rage had a way of steadying your grip when you finally understood exactly who deserved to bleed for it. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Celeste entered without waiting for permission, her face grim in the pre-dawn light. Your uncle received my message. He's mobilizing his advisors and wants to speak with you directly through secure channels within 12 hours. Celeste set down a sealed letter bearing the crest of the Southern Territories, a silver hawk with talons extended. General Thorne was more complicated. Complicated how? He refuses to meet privately. Says it would appear treasonous if discovered, which means he's already thinking about his position should civil war break out. Celeste's expression was unreadable. However, he suggested an alternative. There's a military review scheduled for tomorrow morning in the training yards. All senior commanders attend. He'll be there, along with 7 other generals who might be persuaded to question the Emperor's recent decisions. A public venue. Seraphina's mind raced through the implications. Where any conversation could be overheard and reported, or where a clever woman could plan ideas in front of multiple witnesses, making it impossible for any single general to be accused of treason because they were all part of the same conversation. Celeste's smile was sharp. Thorne's not stupid. He's giving you an opportunity to test the military's loyalty without committing himself until he sees which way the wind blows. Smart. Cautious. Exactly what she'd expect from a man who'd survived 3 decades of imperial politics and warfare. What time does the review start? Dawn. 6 hours from now. Celeste glanced at the papers spread across the desk. You should rest. You look like death. I feel like death. Serafina rubbed her eyes, smudging the kohl that had taken 2 maids an hour to apply. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who barely resembled the polished empress from the banquet. Good. That woman was a mask anyway. But I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, Lucienne and Merida, looking at each other like I'm already gone. Like I'm a ghost they're relieved to be rid of. Then use it. Use that anger. It's the only thing that'll keep you alive through the next 3 days. Celeste moved to pour wine from a decanter, then stopped. Actually, no more wine. You need to be sharp for the military review. Clear-headed and dangerous. Serafina almost laughed. I don't know how to be dangerous, Celeste. I spent 7 years being everything they wanted. Graceful, diplomatic, non-threatening. I'm the woman who apologized when the emperor forgot my birthday. I don't know how to be what you're asking me to become. You're wrong. Celeste turned to face her fully, and her expression held something fierce. You've always known how to be dangerous. You've just been aiming it at yourself instead of your enemies. All that intelligence you used to navigate court politics, use it to destroy them. All that empathy that made you understand people's motivations, use it to manipulate them. All that grace under pressure, use it as armor while you cut throats with a smile. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Serafina thought about the woman she'd been yesterday, desperate to be loved, willing to shrink herself into whatever shape might finally earn her husband's affection. That woman had been powerful too, in her way. She'd just been pointing all that power inward, tearing herself apart trying to be good enough. What would happen if she turned it outward instead? There's something else you need to know, Celeste said quietly. I debated telling you because it'll hurt, but you need all the information before tomorrow. Tell me. Merida's pregnant, 3 months along. They're planning to announce it at the council meeting as proof that she can provide the heir you couldn't. The world tilted sideways for a moment. Serafina gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow. 3 months. That meant Merida had been pregnant before the winter banquet, before tonight's public humiliation. They'd already replaced her, already created the future they wanted, before even bothering to discard her properly. She was retroactively erased from her own marriage. How do you know this? Serafina's voice came out strangled. Palace servants talk. Merida's been experiencing morning sickness, hiding it carefully, but her maid is loyal to your father's old network. She reported it yesterday. Celeste's jaw was tight. I'm sorry. I know how much you want it. Don't. Serafina held up a hand, fighting the wave of grief threatening to drown her. Don't say it. Don't make me think about what I wanted because it doesn't matter anymore. They took it. They took everything. My position, my dignity, my chance at being a mother, and now they're going to parade her pregnancy in front of the council like it's proof of my inadequacy. She stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. Every step felt like walking on broken glass, but she kept moving because stopping meant feeling the full weight of what had been stolen from her. I need to focus, she said, more to herself than Celeste. I need to take this information and figure out how to use it. There has to be an angle. There's always an angle. What are you thinking? Serafina's mind was already racing through possibilities, discarding emotional responses in favor of strategic ones. It hurt. God, it hurt like losing her daughter all over again. But pain was useful if you could channel it into fuel. Imperial succession law, she said slowly. If Merida's carrying Lucian's child, but they're not married yet, what's the legal status of that heir? Celeste's eyes widened with understanding. Illegitimate. The child has no claim to the throne unless they marry before the birth, or unless the emperor formally legitimizes the child through council decree. Which means Lucienne needs the council meeting to happen quickly and go smoothly. He needs me discredited and removed before Merida's pregnancy becomes obvious, so he can marry her and legitimize the heir without any legal complications. Serafina felt something click into place. He's on a timeline. That's why he humiliated me tonight instead of handling this quietly through private divorce proceedings. He needs public justification for a fast annulment. So if you could delay the council meeting or discredit it, make it legally questionable, challenge the validity of the evidence they've manufactured. Serafina was pacing faster now, pieces falling into place. If I can prove even one document was forged, it throws the entire case into question. and if the case is questionable, the council can't legally rule on succession changes. Which means the baby would be born illegitimate, and Lucienne would have to fight for legitimization while you're still legally empress. Celeste's smile was vicious. The scandal would be enormous, the Empire's emperor having a bastard child with his mistress while his lawful wife still holds her title. It wouldn't just be scandal, it would be ammunition for anyone who opposes him, foreign powers, rival noble houses, military commanders who value traditional law. Serafina stopped pacing, her mind crystallizing around a strategy that was ruthless and brilliant and absolutely necessary. I don't have to win the council meeting, I just have to make it invalid long enough to destroy his timeline. And then what? You can't stay married to him. Even if you delay this, he'll eventually find a way to divorce you. I don't want to stay married to him. The words came out cold and certain. I want to burn his empire down around his ears and rebuild it under my own authority. But that takes time and allies and leverage. This just buys me the space to gather all three. Celeste studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're starting to think like an empress instead of a wife. Good. You'll need that clarity for what comes next. What comes next is the military review. I need to plant doubt about the council's legitimacy in front of those generals without appearing to commit treason myself. Serafina moved back to her desk, studying the forged documents with new purpose. If I can get even one senior commander to question the legal validity of the proceeding, it forces the Emperor to acknowledge the challenge publicly. Thorn won't do it. He's too cautious. I'm not targeting Thorn. I'm targeting the generals who served with my father, the ones who remember when imperial law actually meant something before Lucian started bending it to serve his interests. Serafina pulled out a specific document, a forged medical report claiming she'd shown signs of hysteria after her second miscarriage. General Cade lost his own daughter to childbirth complications 5 years ago. He spent 3 months in mourning, nearly retired from service. If I can make him see this report as a weapon being used against a grieving mother, he'll recognize it for what it is. Cruelty disguised as legal process. Celeste's expression shifted to something like respect. You're going to make them see you as a victim of injustice instead of a failed empress. I'm going to make them see me as a woman fighting against a corrupt system that's trying to erase her. And then I'm going to give them a choice, uphold the law they swore to defend, or become complicit in its destruction. Serafina met Celeste's eyes. Men like General Cade don't betray their oaths easily, but if I can make him believe that silence equals betrayal of everything he stands for, he'll speak. And once one general questions the Emperor's actions, the others have permission to do the same. That's dangerous thinking. If you miscalculate, if they report this conversation to Lucian, then I'm dead 3 days early instead of 3 days from now. Either way, staying silent guarantees my destruction. Serafina felt that cold clarity settling over her again, the one that made hard decisions feel inevitable instead of impossible. I'm done protecting myself by making myself smaller. If I'm going to burn, I'm taking the whole palace with me. Dawn broke over the imperial training yards with the kind of pale light that made everything look washed out and unforgiving. Serafina stood at the edge of the observation platform, watching 300 soldiers run through combat drills with mechanical precision. The rhythmic clash of steel on steel echoed off stone walls, punctuated by sergeants barking orders in voices that could strip paint. She dressed carefully for this encounter, not in the elaborate gowns that marked her as empress, but in a simpler riding outfit of dark leather and deep crimson that allowed freedom of movement. No crown, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face and the circles under her eyes. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who hadn't slept, who'd spent the night planning survival instead of mourning her losses. The 8 generals arrived in a cluster, their military uniforms crisp and decorated with decades of service medals. General Marcus Thorn led them, 60 years old, built like a stone wall, with gray hair cropped military short and eyes that missed nothing. He saw her immediately, and his expression flickered with something that might have been surprise before settling into careful neutrality. She'd caught him off guard by showing up. Good. Off-balance people made mistakes. General Cade was there too. Younger than Thorn by a decade, but carrying himself with the weight of someone who'd seen too much death. His daughter's name had been Iris. Serafina had sent flowers to the funeral and a personal letter of condolence that had taken her 3 hours to write because she'd wanted every word to be genuine. She was about to weaponize that kindness, and part of her hated herself for it. The generals approached the platform where she stood, their boots heavy on the wooden stairs. Military protocol required them to bow to the Empress, but the bows were perfunctory at best, the kind of gesture that fulfilled obligation without offering respect. "Your Majesty." Thorne's voice was gravel and iron. "We weren't expecting your presence at this morning's review." "I'm full of surprises lately," Serafina replied, keeping her tone light despite the tension crackling through the air. "I thought I'd observe the training exercises. It's been too long since I visited the military grounds. Imperial visits are typically scheduled in advance through proper channels." Another general, Castellane, she thought his name was, stepped forward with poorly concealed irritation. "For security purposes. I wasn't aware I needed permission to walk my own palace grounds." Serafina let steel creep into her voice. "Have the protocols changed recently? Perhaps during one of those council meetings I apparently missed?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Several generals exchanged glances, and she could see them reassessing her. The Empress didn't usually have claws. Time to press the advantage. "I actually came to ask your professional opinion on a legal matter," Serafina continued, pulling a folded document from inside her jacket. "It involves military regulations regarding evidence standards and due process. Since you're all experts in imperial law as it applies to your ranks, I thought you might offer some clarity." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "What kind of legal matter?" "The kind that determines whether evidence used in court proceedings is legitimate or manufactured." She unfolded the document, the forged medical report, and held it up so they could see the official imperial seal embossed at the top. "I've been informed that this medical assessment will be presented to the High Council in 2 days as evidence of my mental instability. I'm curious whether any of you recognize the signature on the physician's certification." General Cade stepped forward, squinting at the paper. His face went rigid. "That's not possible." "What's not possible?" "This signature belongs to Chief Physician Aldrich Moss. He's been dead for 6 months." Cade's voice was cold with fury. "He died of heart failure last autumn. I was at his funeral." Serafina felt triumph surge through her veins but kept her expression neutral. "Are you certain?" "I'm certain. Moss served in the military medical corps for 30 years before transferring to palace service. I knew him personally." Cade took the document from her hands, examining it with the kind of attention to detail that had kept him alive through countless battles. "This is dated 3 weeks ago. Either the good physician has risen from the grave to sign medical reports, or someone is forging documents using a dead man's credentials." The other generals moved closer, studying the paper with varying expressions of suspicion and anger. Serafina watched them process the implication, watched doubt spread through their ranks like poison in clean water. "Forgery is a serious accusation," Thorne said carefully. "Are you claiming the Emperor is presenting falsified evidence to the Council?" "I'm claiming that someone is. Whether it's the Emperor directly or advisors acting on his behalf, I don't know." Serafina met his eyes without flinching. "But this document is supposed to prove I'm mentally unfit to serve as Empress. It's supposed to justify annulling my marriage and stripping my family of titles and territories. And it's signed by a corpse." "Why bring this to us?" General Castellane demanded. "This is a matter for the High Council, not military commanders. Because the High Council is compromised." Serafina let that statement hang in the air for 3 heartbeats. Half the members have received bribes or favorable contracts in the past 18 months. The other half are too frightened of imperial displeasure to question anything. If I present this evidence during the council meeting, it'll be dismissed or buried. But if military leadership raises questions about the legal validity of forged documents being used in official proceedings, the Emperor can't ignore it without appearing to condone fraud. Thorne's expression was unreadable. "You're asking us to challenge the Emperor's integrity in public. I'm asking you to uphold the law you swore to defend." Serafina's voice carried the weight of genuine conviction because this part, at least, was true. Imperial law requires evidence presented to the High Council to be verified and legitimate. If forged documents are acceptable, then any emperor could manufacture whatever evidence he needs to destroy anyone who opposes him. Today it's me. Tomorrow it could be any general who questions a military decision or any noble who refuses an unjust order. She watched that logic work its way through their minds. Military commanders lived and died by chain of command and rule of law. The idea that evidence could be fabricated without consequence threatened the entire structure they'd built their careers around. "This is a dangerous conversation," General Cade said quietly. "If we're wrong, if this document somehow is legitimate, then I'm a mad woman grasping at straws to save myself from justified consequences." Serafina's voice was steady. "But if I'm right, you're watching the legal foundation of the empire being dismantled by a man who's willing to forge documents and murder unborn children to maintain power." Cade's head snapped up. What? She'd gone too far, said more than she intended, but there was no taking it back now. Serafina pulled out the second document, the financial record showing payment to the palace physician who'd sabotaged her pregnancy. "My second daughter died because someone altered my prenatal medications to induce premature labor." Her voice cracked despite her best efforts to stay cold. "I have evidence that the physician responsible was paid 20,000 gold marks 3 weeks before my miscarriage. The same physician who later provided testimony about my supposed mental breakdown following the loss." The silence was absolute. 8 military commanders stared at her with expressions ranging from horror to fury to careful calculation. She'd just accused the emperor of murdering an imperial heir, treason if she couldn't prove it, justification for revolt if she could. "You're playing with fire," Thorne said softly. "Accusations like that could start a civil war." Accusations like that could also be true. Serafina met his eyes. "And if they're true, what kind of emperor murders his own child just to justify divorcing a wife he's tired of?" General Cade was still staring at the financial records, his hands shaking slightly. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "My daughter died in childbirth because the midwife made a mistake. A stupid, preventable mistake that cost me my child and nearly destroyed me. If someone had deliberately sabotaged her care, if someone had murdered her for political convenience..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The rage in his eyes said everything. "I'm not asking you to commit treason," Serafina said carefully. "I'm not asking you to overthrow the emperor or march on the palace. I'm asking you to do your jobs. Verify evidence. Question inconsistencies. Demand that the legal process be followed according to imperial law. If I'm wrong, the truth will prove it. If I'm right, you'll have upheld your oaths to protect the empire from corruption." Thorne was silent for a long moment, his expression carved from granite. Finally, he spoke. "The military review will continue as scheduled. We have training exercises to oversee and soldiers to command." His eyes held a message she couldn't quite read. "However, several of us will be attending the High Council meeting in 2 days as official observers. Imperial law grants senior military leadership the right to witness proceedings that involve succession matters. We'll be exercising that right." It wasn't an open commitment, but it was something. They'd be there. They'd be watching, and they'd have questions that the emperor would need to answer in front of witnesses who couldn't be easily dismissed or bribed. "Thank you, General Thorne." Serafina inclined her head with genuine gratitude. "For your service to the empire and for your commitment to the law." "Don't thank me yet," Thorne said grimly. "If your evidence doesn't hold up under scrutiny, you'll have made powerful enemies of everyone in this courtyard." "I already have powerful enemies. At least now I have potential allies, too." The generals dispersed back to their duties, but General Cade lingered, staring at the document she'd shown them. When the others were out of earshot, he spoke quietly. "My daughter's name was Iris. You sent flowers to her funeral. White lilies. Her favorite. I remember. Most nobles sent whatever their servants picked out. You wrote a personal letter about losing your first child, about how grief doesn't follow rules or timelines, and how people who tell you to move on don't understand that some losses remake you entirely." His voice was thick with emotion. "That letter got me through some dark nights." Serafina's throat tightened. "I meant every word." "I know you did. That's why I'm telling you this. Be careful. The emperor has survived 3 assassination attempts and 2 attempted coups. He's ruthless when threatened, and you've just painted a target on your back that can be seen from orbit." Cade finally looked at her, and his expression was haunted. "But if what you've shown me is true, if he really did murder your child for political convenience, then he's not just ruthless. He's evil. And evil shouldn't sit on the throne, no matter what uniform it wears." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Serafina alone on the observation platform with her documents and her dangerous new reality. She'd done it. She'd planted doubt in the military leadership, created potential allies, forced the Emperor to defend his evidence in front of witnesses who cared about truth. But Cade was right. She'd also just declared war on the most powerful man in the Empire without any guarantee that her allies would actually fight when the moment came. The soldiers below continued their drills, oblivious to the political earthquake happening above their heads. Steel clashed against steel, sergeants shouted orders, and the machine of imperial military power ground forward with mechanical efficiency. Serafina watched them and wondered how many of those soldiers would be asked to choose sides in the coming conflict. How many would die because she'd decided survival was worth more than peace? The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it just made her angry all over again. She hadn't started this war. Lucien had when he'd poisoned her pregnancy and forged documents and systematically destroyed her family's power while smiling to her face. She was just finishing it. By the time Serafina returned to her chambers, the palace was fully awake and buzzing with nervous energy. Servants whispered in corners, nobles huddled in private conversations, and the air itself felt charged with anticipation. News of her appearance at the military review had spread faster than she'd expected. Within hours, 3 different noble houses had sent requests for private audiences, requests that were transparently attempts to figure out which side of the coming conflict was safer to support. She denied them all. Let them sweat. Let them wonder. Uncertainty was a weapon too. Celeste met her at the door with barely concealed excitement. Your uncle sent a formal response through secure channels. He's calling an emergency session of the Southern Territorial Council to discuss matters of imperial law and family honor. That's code, Your Majesty. He's mobilizing for possible secession. Serafina felt her heart rate spike. How fast? 5 days. Maybe a week if the Emperor moves to suppress it. But your uncle has positioned troops near key infrastructure and trade routes. If Lucien sends forces south, it'll trigger automatic defensive protocols that technically aren't rebellion because they're responding to imperial aggression. Celeste's smile was fierce. Your uncle learned strategy from your father. He's giving you leverage without committing actual treason until you give the signal. And if I give that signal, if I tell him to formally challenge the Emperor's authority, then the Southern Territories secede. Foreign powers start circling like sharks sensing blood in the water. And the military has to choose between supporting an emperor who's losing control or backing the legal process you're trying to defend. Celeste paused. It would also mean thousands of deaths, possibly a civil war that tears the empire apart for a generation. The weight of that possibility should have crushed her. Instead, Serafina felt something cold and certain settle into her bones. She'd spent 7 years trying to hold the empire together through grace and diplomacy and personal sacrifice. She'd swallowed every insult, accepted every humiliation, carved pieces of herself away trying to be what they needed, and they'd responded by trying to erase her. Maybe the Empire deserved to burn if that's what it took to rebuild something better. Not yet, Serafina said finally. Keep my uncle ready but not committed. I need to see how the council meeting plays out first. If I can invalidate their evidence and force a mistrial, we might avoid bloodshed. And if you can't? Then I light the match and watch it all burn. Celeste studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. You've changed. In less than a day, you've gone from grieving wife to revolutionary. I'm not sure whether to be impressed or terrified. Be both. I am. Serafina moved to the window, staring out at the palace grounds where her entire life had been built on lies. I keep thinking about the woman I was yesterday, how desperate she was to save a marriage that was already dead. How much energy she wasted trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it. She wasn't weak, that woman. She was just aiming all her strength in the wrong direction. She was a fool. Serafina's voice was flat. She believed in fairy tales and true love and the power of patience. She thought if she was just good enough, kind enough, selfless enough, eventually he'd see her worth. And now? Now I know better. Love doesn't conquer anything except the people stupid enough to believe in it. Serafina turned from the window, and her expression was carved from ice. Power conquers, strategy conquers. Being willing to sacrifice everything, including your own humanity, that conquers. Everything else is just pretty lies we tell ourselves to avoid facing how brutal survival actually is. That's a dark philosophy. It's an honest one. Serafina's smile held no warmth. And honesty is the only luxury I have left. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of preparation and political maneuvering. Serafina barely slept, surviving on determination and the cold fury that had replaced every softer emotion in her chest. She memorized every document, every piece of evidence, every legal precedent that might save her life during the council meeting. Celeste brought her updates hourly. The military generals were asking questions about evidence protocols. Her uncle had positioned troops in defensive formations that looked peaceful but could turn aggressive within hours. 3 council members had suddenly developed mysterious illnesses that would prevent them from attending the meeting. That last part made Serafina smile grimly. Someone was getting nervous. Someone realized the careful trap they'd set was showing its seams. Good. Let them panic. Let them scramble. On the evening before the council meeting, Lucien sent a messenger requesting private audience. The audacity of it nearly made her laugh. After publicly humiliating her in front of 2,000 nobles, after systematically destroying her family's power, after murdering her child, he wanted to talk privately. She accepted the meeting, not because she had anything to say to him, but because refusing would look like weakness. And she needed him to underestimate her just a little bit longer. He arrived at midnight, without fanfare or guards, dressed in simple civilian clothes that made him look less like an emperor and more like the man she'd fallen in love with a decade ago. That version of him had been kind sometimes, affectionate in rare, unguarded moments, capable of laughing at stupid jokes and holding her hand during thunderstorms. That man had either never existed or had died so long ago she couldn't remember when. Serafina. He stood in her doorway, and for just a moment something flickered across his face that might have been regret. Thank you for agreeing to see me. You're the emperor. I don't have much choice. She didn't invite him to sit, didn't offer wine or any of the courtesies that might have softened this confrontation. What do you want, Lucien? To apologize. The words sounded genuine, which made them more insulting than an obvious lie. For how I handled the announcement at the banquet. For humiliating you publicly when I could have done this privately with dignity. But not for the betrayal itself. Not for the affair or the conspiracy or the fact that you're trying to erase 7 years of marriage like they never happened. Serafina's voice was steady. Just for the embarrassing parts. His jaw tightened. I didn't want it to be like this. How did you want it to be? Did you imagine I'd just accept being discarded? That I'd smile gracefully and fade into obscurity while you married my best friend and raised the child she conceived while you were still married to me? She can give me an heir you couldn't. Lucien said it like stating a fact, like her inability to successfully carry a pregnancy to term was just a practical limitation rather than a wound that had nearly destroyed her. The empire needs stability. It needs succession. The empire needs honest leadership that doesn't forge documents and murder inconvenient children. Serafina watched his expression freeze. Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't discover you paid to have my pregnancy sabotaged? That's a lie. It's documented. Financial records, testimony from palace servants, evidence that I'll present to the council tomorrow. She took a step toward him, and he actually backed up slightly. You killed our daughter, Lucien. You murdered your own child because keeping me grieving and isolated made it easier to destroy my family's power without me noticing. He stopped and something cold passed through his eyes. You can't prove any of that. Can't I? We'll find out tomorrow. Serafina felt that icy calm settle over her again, the one that made impossible decisions feel inevitable. But here's what I don't understand. Why go through all this elaborate conspiracy when you could have just divorced me quietly? Why the public humiliation, the forged evidence, the systematic destruction of everything I built? Lucien was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of truth. Because you're dangerous, Serafina. More dangerous than you realize. People love you, the nobles, the common citizens, even my own military commanders respect you. If I'd simply divorced you and let you retain your status and connections, you could have become a rival power center, a sympathetic figure who threatened my authority just by existing. So you decided to destroy me completely, to make me so broken and discredited that I couldn't possibly be a threat. I decided to protect my empire. He said it without apology, without shame. You would have done the same in my position. No. Serafina's voice was soft but absolute. I wouldn't have. Because I actually loved you, you bastard. And love, even stupid, naive, self-destructive love, doesn't murder children and betray trust. Only ambition does that. Only someone who cares more about power than people. Then you're weaker than I thought. Lucian's expression hardened into something cruel. And tomorrow will prove it. The council will rule against you, your family will lose their territories, and Merida will become empress. Fight all you want, but you've already lost. He turned to leave, and Serafina felt the moment crystallize into something irreversible. This was the point of no return. The moment where mercy died and war became inevitable. Lucien. He stopped at the doorway, glancing back. I want you to remember this conversation tomorrow, Serafina said quietly. When your carefully constructed case falls apart. When the military starts asking questions you can't answer. When you realize the broken, grieving wife you dismissed was actually paying attention the entire time. I want you to remember that you did this to yourself. His expression flickered with uncertainty, there and gone in a heartbeat, before settling back into imperial arrogance. We'll see. After he left, Serafina stood alone in her chambers, surrounded by documents and evidence and the ruins of everything she'd once believed in. Tomorrow would determine everything. Tomorrow, she'd either invalidate the Emperor's case and buy herself time to gather real power, or she'd be destroyed completely. Either way, the gentle Empress who desperately wanted to be loved was dead and buried. What remained was something colder, sharper, absolutely unwilling to go quietly into exile and obscurity. Serafina Vale had been betrayed, humiliated, and marked for destruction by the man she'd loved and the empire she'd served. Now she was going to teach them all a lesson about underestimating wounded empresses with nothing left to lose. The war was just beginning, and she'd burn the whole palace down before she let them erase her. The High Council chamber was built to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings that swallowed sound, marble columns thick as ancient trees, and a semicircular table of black oak where 13 council members sat in judgment like gods deciding the fate of mortals. Morning light filtered through stained glass windows, painting everything in shades of blood and gold. Serafina entered alone, her footsteps echoing against stone that had witnessed 3 centuries of verdicts. She wore midnight blue today, the color of mourning in the old empire, before Lucien's family had rewritten even grief into something more convenient. Her hair was arranged simply, no crown, no elaborate jewelry, just a woman standing before her executioners with nothing but truth and fury as armor. The gallery above was packed. 200 nobles crammed into spaces meant for half that number, all desperate to witness the Empress's public destruction. She could feel their eyes crawling over her like insects, hungry for blood and scandal in equal measure. The 8 military generals sat in a special section reserved for official observers. General Thorne's face was carved granite, revealing nothing. General Cade wouldn't meet her eyes, which could mean sympathy or cowardice depending on how the next few hours played out. Lucien sat at the center of the council table in the Emperor's chair, throne in all but name, with Merida positioned slightly behind him in an advisor's seat. Her former friend wore pale green silk that emphasized the gentle swell of her belly. The pregnancy she'd hidden for 3 months now displayed like a battle standard. Look what I can do that you couldn't. Look at the future I'm carrying while you stand there empty and obsolete. Serafina met Merida's eyes across the chamber and saw something she hadn't expected. Not triumph or cruelty, but exhaustion. The kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying guilt you couldn't quite justify away. Good. Let her choke on it. Lord Chancellor Voss called the session to order, his ancient voice surprisingly strong. He'd served 4 emperors and survived by being flexible with his principles whenever power demanded it. Today, he'd probably bend himself into whatever shape kept him breathing. The charges were read aloud in formal language that made attempted erasure sound like bureaucratic procedure. Failure to provide an heir. Mental instability documented by medical professionals. Behavior unbecoming of imperial dignity. Each accusation was technically phrased as concern for her well-being while actually building a legal case for annulment and exile. They'd made it sound so reasonable, so justified, like destroying her was an act of mercy rather than murder. When the Chancellor finally finished, he turned to Serafina with an expression that might have been sympathy if you squinted hard enough and ignored the calculation in his eyes. Your Majesty, You've requested the opportunity to respond to these charges. The council recognizes your right to present evidence and testimony in your defense. Serafina stepped forward into the open space before the council table. Alone, exposed, exactly where they wanted her. I thank the council for granting me this opportunity to defend myself against accusations that conveniently ignore one crucial detail. Her voice carried clearly through the chamber, steady, despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Most of the evidence being used to destroy me is fabricated. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Lucian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Wariness, maybe. Or surprise that she'd gone on the offensive immediately instead of groveling for mercy. That's a serious claim, Lord Chancellor Voss said carefully. Do you have proof? I have a dead man's signature on a medical report dated 3 weeks ago. Serafina produced the forged document, holding it up so the entire chamber could see the imperial seal. Chief Physician Aldrich Moss, whose certification appears on this assessment of my mental state, died 6 months ago. I have testimony from multiple witnesses, including General Cade, who attended his funeral. Every head in the room turned toward the military section. General Cade stood slowly, his face grim. The Empress speaks truth. Physician Moss died last autumn of heart failure. I was present at his memorial service along with 30 other officers who'd served with him in the military medical corps. His voice was hard as iron. That signature is either supernatural or fraudulent, and I don't believe in ghosts. The chamber erupted. Nobles shouting questions, council members demanding explanations, the careful choreography of Serafina's destruction suddenly thrown into chaos by a single undeniable fact. A corpse couldn't sign documents. Lord Chancellor Voss hammered his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Lucien's expression had gone cold and dangerous, his eyes locked on Serafina with the kind of fury that preceded executions. This document was provided by the Imperial Medical Office, Council Member Valeria said loudly, trying to salvage the situation. If there's been an administrative error... Administrative error? Serafina's laugh was sharp enough to cut. A dead man signing official documents isn't an error. It's fraud. It's falsifying evidence to support a predetermined conclusion, and it throws every other piece of evidence against me into question. She was winning. She could feel it in the nervous energy rippling through the chamber, in the way council members were exchanging uncertain glances, and how the military generals were leaning forward with predatory interest. Then Merida stood. May I address the council? Every eye turned to her. Lucian's head snapped around, his expression shifting from fury to something that looked almost like warning. But Merida ignored him, stepping forward with the careful movements of someone carrying precious cargo. Lady Ashton, the Chancellor said slowly, you're not on trial here. No, but I'm the woman being offered as replacement for the Empress. I think that gives me standing to speak. Merida's voice was steady, but Serafina could see her hands trembling, especially since I have information that might clarify certain complexities. Serafina felt ice flood her veins. This wasn't in the script. Merida was supposed to sit quietly and play the role of innocent victim caught in tragic circumstances. She wasn't supposed to speak. The forged document is real, Merida said quietly, and the chamber went absolutely silent. I know, because I helped create it. The world tilted sideways. Serafina gripped the edge of the nearest table to keep from falling, her vision narrowing to a tunnel with Merida at the center of it. What are you doing? Lucien's voice was low and deadly, but Merida didn't look at him. The truth. For once. Merida turned to face the council, her beautiful face pale but determined. 6 months ago, the Emperor approached me with a proposal. He wanted to divorce Serafina but needed legal justification that wouldn't damage his reputation or trigger rebellion from her family's territories. So we manufactured evidence, forged documents, bribed officials, created a narrative of mental instability that would make the annulment appear necessary rather than cruel. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Council members looked at each other in shock. Nobles pressed forward trying to hear better, and the military generals sat frozen in their seats. Serafina couldn't breathe. This wasn't possible. Merida was confessing, exposing the entire conspiracy, destroying both herself and Lucian in front of 200 witnesses. Why? What possible reason? I did it because I loved him, Merida continued, and her voice cracked. Because he told me he was trapped in a loveless marriage with a woman who couldn't give him heirs. Because I believed we were saving the empire by ensuring succession. I convinced myself that the ends justified the means, that a few lies were acceptable if they prevented chaos. She finally looked at Serafina, and her eyes were filled with tears that looked genuine. But watching you these past 2 days, seeing what we've done to you, I can't carry it anymore. The guilt is eating me alive, Sarah. You trusted me. You called me sister. And I betrayed you in the worst possible way because I wanted what you had and told myself it was for the greater good. Serafina felt something crack behind her sternum. This was the twist she hadn't seen coming. Not that Merida was evil, she'd already known that, but that Merida was human enough to break under the weight of her own choices. It should have felt like victory. Public confession from one of the conspirators, complete vindication of everything she'd claimed. Instead, it felt like standing in ruins, victorious and utterly destroyed. You're lying! Lucien stood abruptly, his voice carrying absolute authority. You're emotionally compromised by pregnancy hormones. Saying things you don't mean. I'm saying things I should have said months ago. Merida turned to face him, and something in her expression had hardened. You used me, Lucien. Used my feelings for you, my ambition, my jealousy of Serafina's position. You manipulated me into becoming your weapon against her, and I was stupid enough to let you. Sit down before you destroy both of us. We're already destroyed. I'm just making it official. Merida looked back at the council. I have documents, letters between the Emperor and various conspirators, financial records of bribes paid, detailed instructions for forging evidence. Everything is stored in a location that will automatically be delivered to the military if anything happens to me. Insurance. She'd built insurance against Lucien turning on her the same way he'd turned on Serafina. Smart. Ruthless. Exactly what survival required in a palace full of predators. Lord Chancellor Voss looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 5 minutes. This is unprecedented. If what you're claiming is true, it constitutes massive violations of imperial law by the Emperor himself. Arrest her. Lucien's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She's clearly mentally unstable, possibly influenced by the Empress to make false accusations. Oh, like the false accusations you made against Serafina? General Thorne stood, and his presence commanded instant attention. Seems convenient that everyone who opposes you is suddenly mentally unstable, Your Majesty. The military section erupted with generals rising to their feet. Not all 8. 3 remained seated, loyal to the Emperor even now. But 5 generals standing in public challenge to imperial authority was enough to shift the entire balance of power in the room. We request a full investigation, Thorne continued, his voice hard as steel. Independent review of all evidence, testimony from palace servants, examination of financial records. If the Emperor has violated imperial law to manufacture a case against his lawful wife, that's treason, and treason doesn't wear a crown. Treason. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Lucien's face had gone white with fury, his hands gripping the arms of his chair hard enough to leave marks in the wood. For the first time since she'd known him, Serafina saw genuine fear in his eyes. He was losing control. The careful trap he'd spent 18 months building was collapsing around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it without making everything worse. This council is suspended pending investigation, Lord Chancellor Voss declared, his voice shaking. All parties will remain in the palace under guard until the matter is resolved. No! Serafina's voice cut through the chaos, silencing everyone instantly. She stepped forward, and every eye in the chamber locked on her. I appreciate Lady Ashton's sudden attack of conscience, and I'm grateful the military is finally questioning the Emperor's integrity. But let's not pretend this changes anything fundamental. Her voice was cold, surgical. You all knew. Maybe not the specific details, but you knew something was wrong. You watched me be systematically isolated and humiliated. You saw my family lose positions and power, and none of you said a word because it was safer to stay silent. She turned in a slow circle, making eye contact with nobles and council members who suddenly couldn't meet her gaze. So don't congratulate yourselves for demanding investigation now that the conspiracy has been exposed. You're not heroes. You're accomplices who only care about justice when it's convenient. Serafina's smile was bitter. But you're right about one thing. This does need to be investigated. Every bribe, every forged document, every person who participated in trying to erase me from history. And when we're done, we're going to have a very serious conversation about what kind of empire allows its emperor to murder infants and forge evidence without consequence. The silence that followed was absolute. She'd just accused Lucian of infanticide in front of the entire court, backed by enough credibility from Merida's confession that people couldn't dismiss it as ravings from a desperate woman. Lucien stood slowly, and the look in his eyes promised death. "You're going to regret this," he said quietly, and the threat was clear to everyone listening. "I already regret marrying you. Everything else is just details." Serafina turned toward the exit, done with performing for an audience that had watched her be destroyed for entertainment. "Guards, arrest the Empress!" Lucien's command rang out sharp and absolute. 20 Imperial guards along the chamber walls moved immediately, hands going to weapons as they closed in on Serafina from all sides. "On what charge?" General Thorne demanded, his own hand dropping to his sword hilt. "Sedition, conspiracy, speaking treason against the crown in open court." Lucian's voice was ice and murder. "She can make her accusations from a cell while we investigate, along with Lady Ashton, who clearly is mentally compromised and requires protective custody." The guards hesitated, caught between Imperial command and military leadership that was clearly opposed. Serafina watched them calculate, trying to figure out which side was more dangerous to defy. Then one guard stepped forward, young, maybe 25, with the kind of idealistic expression that hadn't been beaten out of him yet by palace politics. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," he said, looking at Lucian, "but I swore an oath to uphold imperial law. If the Empress is right, and you've falsified evidence to commit treason, I can't follow your orders." 3 more guards stepped back, lowering their weapons. Not many, 16 remained loyal to the Emperor, but enough to matter. Enough to prove the Empire was fracturing in real time. "This is mutiny," Lucian snarled, and his hand moved to the ceremonial sword at his belt. "I'll have every single one of you executed. Try it." General Cade's voice was quiet, but deadly. "Order executions for guards following their legal oaths, and you'll have a full military revolt before sunset." The standoff stretched like wire about to snap. Guards with hands on weapons, generals ready to intervene, nobles pressed against walls trying to avoid being caught in the middle, and at the center of it all, Serafina and Lucien, locked in a battle that was about so much more than a marriage. It was about who controlled the empire, whether law meant anything or was just decoration for whoever held power. Whether justice existed or was simply a story they told themselves to avoid facing how brutal the truth actually was. Lord Chancellor Voss looked ready to collapse. "Please, we need to de-escalate before this becomes violence. The Emperor's concerns about security are valid, but arresting the Empress without proper procedure after the irregularities we've just discovered would only validate her accusations." "So what do you suggest?" Lucian demanded, still poised like a blade ready to strike. "House arrest for both the Empress and Lady Ashton until the investigation concludes. Separate quarters, equal treatment, no prejudgment of guilt." Voss's voice was pleading. "And the Emperor submits to questioning about the allegations raised. Complete transparency. That's the only way to preserve any legitimacy for whatever the Council ultimately decides." It was a compromise nobody wanted, but everyone could survive. For now. Lucien's jaw worked like he was chewing glass, but he finally nodded once. "Fine, but the investigation will be completed within 1 week, and if the Empress is found to have made false accusations, I want maximum penalties applied." "Agreed," Serafina said before anyone could speak for her. "And when I'm vindicated, I want every conspirator punished according to imperial law. No exceptions, no mercy." She met Lucien's eyes across the chamber, and what passed between them was pure hatred refined to its sharpest edge. No more pretense of civility, no more masks. Just 2 people who'd once shared a bed, now committed to destroying each other completely. The guards escorted Serafina back to her chambers with more gentleness than she expected. Maybe they were hedging their bets, unsure which side would ultimately win. Or maybe some small part of them recognized what had been done to her was wrong, even if they hadn't been brave enough to stop it. Celeste was waiting when she arrived, her face pale with barely contained emotion. "I heard everything. The entire palace is talking about it." She gripped Serafina's hands hard. You did it. You exposed the conspiracy, got military support, forced an investigation. I didn't do anything except survive another day. Serafina pulled away, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens where she used to walk with Merida, back when she'd been stupid enough to believe in friendship. Merida's confession changed everything. Without that, I had documents and accusations, but no smoking gun. She handed me victory, and I don't even know why. Does it matter? You won. Did I? Serafina laughed bitterly. I'm under house arrest. My husband wants me dead. And the Empire is one wrong move away from civil war. That's not winning. That's just a different flavor of losing. Celeste was quiet for a moment before speaking carefully. What happens now? Now we wait for the investigation that's probably going to get sabotaged by the dozen council members who are complicit in the conspiracy. Serafina pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Lucien's not going to let some inquiry destroy him. He'll find a way to bury evidence, intimidate witnesses, make the whole thing go away. Then we need to move faster, contact your uncle, mobilize the southern territories, and start a war that'll kill thousands while I hide behind my family's armies? Serafina turned from the window, and her expression was haunted. I've spent 2 days preparing to burn the Empire down if necessary, but now that I'm actually standing at the match, I keep thinking about all those soldiers in the training yard, about farmers and merchants and children who will get caught in the crossfire when supply lines are cut and territories start fighting. You didn't create this situation. But I'm the one choosing whether to make it worse. Serafina sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. There's a version of this where I step back, accept exile quietly, let Lucien marry Merida and have his heir, preserve peace even if it means sacrificing myself. Celeste's expression turned fierce. That's the woman you were 3 days ago talking, the one who thought sacrifice was noble instead of stupid. Maybe she was right. Maybe some things are worth sacrificing yourself for. Serafina's voice cracked. I've become so focused on survival that I've stopped asking whether surviving is even the right choice. Listen to me. Celeste knelt beside the chair, gripping Serafina's shoulders. You're exhausted and traumatized and second-guessing yourself because that's what happens when you've been gaslit for years by people you trusted. But the woman who stood in that council chamber today and faced down the Emperor without flinching, that woman is who you really are under all the conditioning they tried to beat into you. That woman is terrifying. Good. Terrifying is what survives. Terrifying is what wins. Celeste's eyes burned with intensity. You asked if you're choosing the right path. Let me tell you what I see. I see an empire rotting from the inside because nobody's brave enough to demand accountability from the powerful. I see a system that murders inconvenient children and forges evidence and rewards traitors while punishing victims. And I see one woman who refused to accept that as normal, who fought back even when it would have been easier to break. And if I keep fighting, people die. Soldiers, civilians, families get torn apart. And if you don't fight, Lucien stays emperor. The corruption continues, and every other woman in a vulnerable position learns that silence and submission are the only safe options. Celeste's voice was hard as stone. You think that's mercy? You think letting him win preserves peace? It just teaches tyrants they can do whatever they want without consequences. The truth of that settled into Serafina's bones like poison and cure in equal measure. Celeste was right. Backing down now wouldn't save lives. It would just delay the inevitable conflict while making it worse. Evil unchallenged became normal. Cruelty unpunished became policy. And tyrants who learned they could destroy people without consequence only became more dangerous. If she stepped back now, Lucien would know he was untouchable. And the next woman he decided to erase would have even less hope than Serafina had started with. I'm so tired, Serafina whispered. I'm tired of being strong and strategic and making impossible choices. I just want to rest. I know, but you don't get that luxury, not yet. Celeste squeezed her hands one more time before standing. Rest tonight. Tomorrow we figure out how to win an investigation that's rigged against us. After Celeste left, Serafina sat alone in the growing darkness, staring at nothing and everything. The palace was quiet tonight, like the entire structure was holding its breath waiting to see what happened next. She thought about Merida's confession, the guilt in her former friend's eyes when she'd finally told the truth. That had been real. Serafina was certain of it, which meant somewhere under all the ambition and betrayal, there was still a human being capable of recognizing when she'd gone too far. It should have made Serafina feel better. Proof that even traitors had consciences, that evil wasn't absolute. Instead, it just made everything more complicated. Because if Merida wasn't a monster, but just a person who'd made terrible choices, what did that make Serafina? She'd spent 2 days planning destruction, preparing to sacrifice thousands for her own survival, becoming exactly the kind of ruthless that Lucian had accused her of lacking. Was she winning or just becoming him? The question haunted her through the long night, keeping her awake while the palace slept. By the time dawn broke, she still didn't have an answer, just the cold certainty that there was no going back to who she'd been before. That woman was dead. What remained was someone harder, colder, willing to do whatever survival required, even if it cost her soul. The investigation began at noon, conducted by a special tribunal of 5 council members chosen for their supposed neutrality. Serafina spent 3 hours being questioned about every decision she'd made as Empress, every conversation with Lucien, every moment of grief after her miscarriages that might be twisted into evidence of instability. They picked at her like vultures cleaning bones, looking for anything that could salvage the original narrative. And despite her evidence, despite Merida's confession, despite everything, she could feel them trying to find a middle ground that wouldn't completely destroy the Emperor's credibility. Because fully acknowledging what Lucien had done meant acknowledging the system itself was broken, that imperial power could be abused without oversight, that the council had failed in their duty to provide checks on authority. Much easier to blur the truth into something manageable. Frame it as a misunderstanding or excessive zeal by over-ambitious advisors. Find a scapegoat who wasn't the Emperor and call it justice. On the 3rd day of investigation, Celeste brought news that made Serafina's blood run cold. 3 witnesses have recanted their testimony. Palace servants who were going to testify about the conspiracy. They've all suddenly claimed they were mistaken or coerced by you into lying. Serafina felt her stomach drop. Lucien got to them, or threatened them, or paid them. Doesn't matter how. What matters is your evidence base is crumbling. Celeste's expression was grim. Without witness testimony backing up the documents, the tribunal can claim everything is circumstantial or misinterpreted. What about Merida? She confessed publicly. She's recanting, claims she was having a breakdown from pregnancy stress and said things she didn't mean. Celeste's voice was bitter. Her new testimony supports the original narrative, that you failed as Empress, and she's simply a tragic figure caught in the middle. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Merida had confessed, exposed everything, given Serafina the ammunition she needed, and now she was taking it all back. Why? What had Lucien offered her? Or more likely, what had he threatened? So we're back where we started, Serafina said quietly. Except now they can add manipulation of witnesses to the charges against me. Not quite. General Cade and the military leadership are refusing to accept the tribunal's findings. They're demanding independent investigation by the military justice system. Celeste paused. But that's going to push the Empire even closer to open conflict. Military challenging civilian authority over the Emperor's actions. It's precedent that could fracture everything. So my choices are accept a rigged verdict in exile or fight back and trigger civil war. Serafina laughed without humor. Some choice. There might be another option. Celeste pulled out a letter sealed with the Silver Hawk of the Southern Territories. Your uncle sent this through secure channels. He's offering asylum if you can reach the border. Full protection, military support, and enough leverage to negotiate terms with Lucien from a position of strength. Asylum means admitting I can't win here. It means abandoning the palace and everyone who supported me. It means surviving to fight another day instead of getting erased by a corrupt system. Celeste's eyes were urgent. You've done everything possible, pushed back harder than anyone expected, but sometimes retreat is the only strategic option when the battlefield is completely rigged. Serafina took the letter, breaking the seal and reading her uncle's words. He'd laid out an escape plan, specific routes, loyal servants who'd assist, safe houses between the palace and the border. He'd thought of everything. All she had to do was run, abandon the empire she'd tried to serve, accept that Lucien had won this round, and hope she could rebuild from exile. It was the smart choice, the rational choice, the choice that kept her alive. It felt like swallowing glass. How long do I have? She asked quietly. The tribunal delivers its verdict tomorrow. After that, you'll either be formally exiled or imprisoned, depending on how bold they're feeling. Celeste's voice was steady, but her eyes held grief. If you're going to run, tonight is the only chance. Tonight. She had until tonight to decide whether she was a fighter or a survivor, whether pride mattered more than breathing, whether the empire was worth dying for. Serafina stood at the window looking out at the palace that had been her home for 7 years, the gardens where she'd walked with Merida, believing in friendship, the grand hall where Lucian had destroyed her publicly while 2,000 nobles watched. Everything she'd built here was ashes. Every relationship was poisoned. Every dream she'd held about love and loyalty and the power of devotion, all of it lies. But running felt like letting them win, like proving Lucien right when he'd called her weak and inadequate, like validating every whisper that she'd never been strong enough to be empress. I need to think, Serafina said finally. Give me until midnight. I'll have an answer by then. Celeste nodded and withdrew, leaving Serafina alone with the most important decision she'd ever make. Stay and face almost certain destruction, or run and live to fight from exile. The hours crawled past like dying things. Serafina paced her chambers, argued with herself, tried to find some third option that didn't exist. Every path led to loss. Every choice meant sacrificing something essential. At 11:30, a soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. When she opened the door, Merida stood there, her face swollen from crying, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Sarah. They have my family. Lucian threatened to destroy them if I didn't recant. I had to. I couldn't let them suffer for my choices. Get out. Serafina's voice was dead cold. Please, just listen. You had your chance to be brave. You took it back. Serafina felt nothing looking at this woman who'd been her closest friend. Not anger, not betrayal, not even disappointment, just emptiness. Whatever happens to your family now is on you. Not me. You. I can still help. I have the documents hidden. I can get them to you. Akishio. And how long before you recant again? Before Lucian threatens something else, and you fold? Serafina leaned against the doorframe, blocking entry. You're not strong enough for this war, Merida. You never were. You wanted the crown and the power, but you weren't willing to pay the price. So go back to him. Have your baby. Be empress. Just stay away from me. Merida's face crumpled completely. I loved you. I still love you. What you did was choose yourself over everything else. Which is fine, most people do. But don't dress it up as love or tragedy or anything noble. Serafina's smile was sharp as broken glass. You wanted what I had, and you took it. The guilt you feel doesn't change that. It just means you're not quite as much of a monster as Lucian. Congratulations on clearing that exceptionally low bar. She closed the door before Merida could respond, shutting out the sound of broken sobs from the woman who'd once been sister in all but blood. The clock chimed midnight and Serafina was out of time. She looked at the letter from her uncle sitting on her desk, the escape plan that offered survival and future possibilities. Then she looked at the forged documents and evidence she'd spent days collecting, the weapons that hadn't been enough to win but might still do damage. Stay or run, fight or survive, die as an empress or live as an exile. In the end, the choice came down to something simpler than strategy or odds of success. It came down to who she wanted to be when this was over. Serafina picked up a pen and began writing letters, not to her uncle or the military or anyone who might save her. Letters to palace servants she'd shown kindness over the years, to nobles who'd served her father, to merchants and craftspeople who'd benefited from her trade policies, to everyone who might remember that the empire was supposed to serve its people, not the emperor's ambition. She wrote about what had been done to her, the corruption she'd uncovered, the system that protected power while crushing anyone who challenged it. She wrote truth without decoration or political calculation. And then she made copies, dozens of copies, hundreds if she had time. Because if she was going to burn, she was taking the whole rotten structure with her. If Lucienne won tomorrow's tribunal verdict, if she was exiled or imprisoned or executed, these letters would survive. These truths would spread. You couldn't kill an idea once it started spreading, couldn't imprison testimony when it was already in the hands of hundreds of people who had their own reasons to question imperial authority. Celeste found her at dawn surrounded by papers and dried ink, still writing. The verdict is in 2 hours. Did you make your decision about escape? Her voice was carefully neutral. I did. Serafina signed the last letter, sealed it, and added it to the pile. I'm not running. I'm going to that tribunal, and I'm going to make them look me in the eye while they destroy me. And when it's done, when Lucian thinks he's won, these letters start circulating. Every truth I've uncovered, every crime he's committed, spreading through the empire like wildfire. That's suicide. Once he realizes what you've done, then he'll have to decide how much brutality he's willing to use to silence truth. And every action he takes to suppress it will just prove I was right about him. Serafina's smile was cold and certain. Either way, I win. Either he leaves me alive and I keep fighting, or he makes me a martyr and turns me into a symbol that's more dangerous than I ever was breathing. Celeste stared at her for a long moment, then slowly smiled. You've stopped trying to survive and started trying to win. I've stopped caring about the difference. Serafina stood, her decision made and absolute. Get these letters to people who'll distribute them if something happens to me. Make sure Lucian knows they exist, but not where they are. That's my insurance policy. Not my survival, but my revenge. She walked to the tribunal 2 hours later with her head high and her spine straight, ready to face whatever verdict they'd manufactured. The chamber was packed again, even more crowded than before because everyone wanted to witness the conclusion of the Empress's destruction. Lord Chancellor Voss read the verdict in a voice that shook with either emotion or cowardice. After 3 days of investigation, the tribunal had determined that while certain irregularities existed in the handling of evidence, there was insufficient proof of deliberate conspiracy by the Emperor. Lady Ashton's confession was deemed unreliable due to pregnancy-related mental instability. The Empress's accusations were considered understandable, given her grief, but ultimately unsubstantiated. The marriage would be annulled. Serafina would retain her family name and a modest allowance, but would be stripped of all imperial titles and required to leave the palace within 24 hours. Exile dressed up as mercy. Lucian sat at the council table watching her with expression of controlled triumph. He'd won. Outmaneuvered her, crushed her resistance, erased her from imperial history just like he'd planned. Serafina looked at him and smiled. It was the smile of someone who knew something he didn't. Someone who'd stopped playing the game he'd designed and started playing a completely different one. I accept the verdict, she said clearly, and watched confusion flicker across his face. I'll leave peacefully and cause no further disruption. I just have one request. What request? Voss asked warily. Allow me to address the court. One final statement before I go. Grant me that dignity at least. The Chancellor looked at Lucian, who hesitated before nodding slightly. What harm could she do with words? She'd already lost everything. Serafina stepped forward into the center of the chamber, and when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner. I came to this palace 10 years ago believing in love and duty and the power of devotion. I thought if I was good enough, kind enough, selfless enough, I could earn the loyalty I gave so freely. I was wrong. You can't earn loyalty from people who see kindness as weakness and devotion as opportunity. She turned slowly, making eye contact with nobles and council members who'd watched her fall. But I learned something more important these past few days. I learned that systems built on corruption can't survive truth. That power without accountability eventually devours itself, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to tyrants is refuse to stay silent. That's enough, Lucian said sharply, but Serafina ignored him. I'm leaving this palace today, stripped of titles, exiled from everything I built, and I'm going with a smile because I know something all of you don't. Her voice dropped to something cold and certain. I've already won. The truth is spreading. Documents are in circulation. Witnesses have been secured, and no matter what happens to me, the Empire is going to know exactly what was done in its name. She watched realization dawn on Lucian's face as he understood what she'd done. The insurance policy that made her more dangerous dead than alive. You can destroy me, Serafina said softly, speaking directly to him now. But you can't destroy what I've created. Truth doesn't die with the messenger. It just spreads faster. The chamber erupted into chaos, but Serafina was already walking toward the exit, her final play made, her future uncertain, but her revenge guaranteed. She'd survived. And more importantly, she'd made damn sure that survival meant something beyond just breathing. The Empress was dead. What remained was something sharper, colder, and absolutely unwilling to let her destruction be for nothing. And somewhere in the Empire, letters were beginning to circulate, carrying truths that would remake the entire game. Serafina had exactly 24 hours to leave the palace before Imperial guards would physically remove her. She spent the first 6 hours burning everything that could be used as evidence against the people who'd helped her. Letters from her uncle, correspondence with sympathetic nobles, notes from Celeste detailing the conspiracy, all of it fed into the fireplace until her chambers reeked of smoke and ash. What she couldn't burn, she memorized. Names, dates, financial transactions. The architecture of corruption that Lucian had built became a map inside her head, impossible to confiscate or destroy. Celeste worked beside her in grim silence, occasionally glancing at the door, as if expecting guards to burst in at any moment despite the agreed timeline. The older woman's hand shook slightly as she helped sort documents into categories. Burn, hide, or smuggle out through channels that couldn't be traced back to Serafina. They'd just finished when rapid footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Not the measured tread of guards, but something faster. Panicked, a young servant girl burst through the door without knocking, her face flushed and terrified. "Your Majesty, former Majesty, you need to come quickly. It's Lady Ashton. Something's wrong." Serafina's first instinct was to refuse. Merida had made her choice, recanted her confession, chosen survival over truth. Whatever crisis she faced now was consequence, not Serafina's responsibility. But the girl's expression held genuine fear, and despite everything, Serafina couldn't quite kill the part of herself that had once loved Merida like a sister. She followed the servant through winding corridors toward the guest wing where Merida had been housed during the investigation. A small crowd had gathered outside one of the rooms. Guards, servants, and the palace physician who'd replaced the one they'd discovered was corrupt. The physician looked up as Serafina approached, his face grave. "She's hemorrhaging. The stress of the past few days triggered early labor complications." His voice was clinical, but his hands were stained dark red. "I've done what I can, but she needs a specialist. The kind of care that requires preparation time we don't have." "Where's the Emperor?" Serafina demanded. Serafina, an emergency council session. The Southern Territories officially declared intention to secede an hour ago. Your uncle's forces have seized 3 major ports. The physician's expression was tight. The Empire is fracturing, and nobody can find Lucian to tell him his mistress is dying. The irony was vicious enough to cut. Lucian had destroyed Serafina's pregnancies to manufacture his case against her, and now the woman he'd chosen as replacement was losing his heir anyway. Sometimes the universe had a sense of humor darker than anything humans could devise. "Let me see her," Serafina said quietly. The physician hesitated, then stepped aside. Celeste grabbed her arm in warning. "This could be a trap, a way to implicate you if something happens to her." "Then it's a trap." Serafina pulled free gently. "But I need to look her in the eye one more time." The room was a disaster of bloodied linens and the sharp medicinal smell that Serafina associated with her own lost pregnancies. Merida lay in the center of it all, her face gray beneath a sheen of sweat, her hands clutching her swollen belly like she could hold the baby inside through sheer will. Her eyes opened when Serafina approached, and what lived in them was pure terror. "I'm dying," Merida whispered. "I can feel it. The baby. Sarah, the baby." "The physician is doing everything possible." Serafina's voice came out steadier than she felt. "You're young and strong. You'll survive this." "Don't lie to me. Not now." Merida's laugh was broken glass. "I'm getting exactly what I deserve, aren't I? Karma, justice, whatever you want to call it. I helped murder your child, and now I'm losing mine." Serafina should have felt satisfaction. Should have seen this as proof that the universe sometimes balanced scales. Instead, she just felt tired and sad and sick of how much blood had been spilled in the name of power and ambition. "Where are the documents?" she asked quietly. "The evidence you said you had hidden. If you die, I need to know where they are." Merida's expression crumpled. "That's why you came. Not to forgive me or hold my hand while I bleed out, just to secure your weapons." "You want forgiveness? From me?" Serafina's voice hardened. "You don't get that. You don't get absolution from the woman whose life you helped destroy. But if you actually want to do something meaningful before you die, tell me where the evidence is so your betrayal at least serves some purpose. Third shelf of the Imperial Library, behind a copy of the Governance Archives Volume 12. There's a loose stone. Merida's breath was coming in gasps now. Everything's there. Letters between Lucian and the council members he bribed, financial records, instructions for forging your medical documents, proof of everything. Why did you recant? Serafina needed to understand. You confessed publicly. You had a chance to do the right thing. Why take it back? Because I'm weak. Tears leaked from Merida's eyes. Because when he threatened my family, I folded. Because deep down, I'm exactly what you said. Someone who wants power, but isn't willing to pay the price for it. You would have let them threaten everyone you loved and still told the truth. That's the difference between us. That's why you should have been Empress, and I'm just this. She gestured weakly at the blood-soaked bed, at the broken mess of her choices catching up with her. If I survive this, Merida continued, voice barely audible, I'm going to testify again. For real this time, no matter what he threatens. I'll tell them everything and accept whatever consequences come. I owe you that much, at least. You don't owe me anything, Serafina said flatly. You owe the Empire. You owe every person who got hurt because you were too ambitious and too cowardly in equal measure. But if you actually follow through and testify, maybe you can die knowing you did one decent thing after all the terrible ones. Merida closed her eyes, fresh tears tracking through sweat and pain. I really did love you, you know. Before the jealousy ate everything else. You were my best friend and I destroyed you because I wanted what you had. There's no forgiveness for that. I know. I need you to know the love part was real once. It doesn't matter if it was real. Serafina's throat was tight, but her voice stayed steady. Love that turns into betrayal is worse than hatred. At least enemies are honest about wanting to destroy you. The physician pushed back into the room, bringing equipment and 2 assistants. He looked at Serafina with clear meaning. She needed to leave so they could work. Serafina turned toward the door, then stopped. Don't die, Merida. Live, testify. Fix what you broke if you can. Her voice was ice and exhaustion. And then spend the rest of your life understanding what it means to be the person who almost destroyed an empire because you couldn't control your jealousy. She walked out before Merida could respond, before the tears threatening to break free could actually fall. Celeste was waiting in the corridor with an expression that held questions she didn't voice. The library, Serafina said quietly. We need to get to the Imperial Library before anyone realizes what she told me. They moved through the palace like ghosts, using servant corridors and avoiding the main halls where nobles and guards congregated. The Southern Territory's secession had thrown everything into chaos. Clusters of advisors arguing in corners, military commanders being summoned for emergency briefings, servants whispering about whether there would be war. The empire was cracking apart, and Serafina was about to pour gasoline on the fire. The Imperial Library was technically restricted during the tribunal period, but the guards stationed at the entrance were young and easily intimidated by the former empress striding toward them with absolute authority still radiating from her spine despite the exile order. I'm collecting personal items before departure, Serafina said coolly. You can accompany me if protocols require it. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Then one nodded. 5 minutes, Your Lady Serafina. That's all we can allow. 5 minutes. Plenty of time if the documents were actually where Merida claimed. The library was massive, 3 stories of books and scrolls documenting centuries of imperial history and law. Serafina headed directly for the governance section, running fingers along spines until she found Archives Volume 12. Her hands were shaking as she pulled the heavy tome from the shelf. Behind it, exactly as described, a stone sat loose in the wall. She pried it out carefully and reached into the hollow space beyond. Her fingers closed on oilcloth wrapped around something solid. She pulled it free, unwrapping layers to reveal a leather journal stuffed with folded documents. Jackpot. Serafina flipped through quickly. Letters in Lucien's handwriting detailing payments to council members, forged medical certifications with notes about which physician had been bribed to sign them, financial ledgers showing money flowing from imperial coffers to various conspirators. Everything. Merida had kept everything. Insurance against Lucien turning on her, probably. Or maybe guilt had made her document her own crimes as some form of penance. Either way, this was the evidence that could destroy the emperor completely if presented properly. "Time's up," the guard called from the library entrance. "We need to escort you back to your chambers." Serafina wrapped the journal back in oilcloth and tucked it inside her dress, the leather cold against her skin. She followed the guards back through corridors that felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. She had the weapon. Now she just needed the right moment to use it. That moment came 3 hours later when Celeste burst into her chambers with news that made Serafina's heart stop. General Thorne and the military commanders have issued an ultimatum. They're demanding the Emperor submit to independent investigation within 24 hours, or they'll consider him in violation of military law and withdraw support. Celeste's eyes were wild. "The Empire is about to have a military coup, Your Majesty, and Lucien's response is to order mass arrests of anyone suspected of disloyalty. He's panicking." Serafina felt cold clarity settle over her, making it worse with every move. "Who's on the arrest list?" "Everyone? Military officers, council members who questioned the verdict, servants suspected of leaking information." Celeste grabbed her hands. "You're at the top. He's not waiting for the 24-hour exile period. Guards are coming for you right now with orders to imprison you for sedition." Serafina's mind raced through options, discarding each one as too slow or too dangerous. She could run to her uncle's forces, but that meant abandoning everyone in the palace who'd supported her. She could try to reach the military commanders, but getting past Imperial guards seemed impossible. Or she could do something insane. "Get me formal court attire," Serafina said suddenly. "The most elaborate dress we have, crown, full Imperial regalia." Celeste stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You were stripped of your title. Wearing Imperial dress is treason, I know." Serafina's smile was sharp and slightly unhinged. "But Lucien's already planning to arrest me for sedition. Might as well give him a real show." "What are you planning?" "To interrupt his emergency council session and present evidence of his crimes in front of every witness possible. Force him to either acknowledge the truth or arrest me publicly for exposing it." Serafina felt that reckless energy building in her chest, the kind that came from having absolutely nothing left to lose. Either way, the Empire watches their emperor choose between accountability and tyranny in real time. "That's suicide." "No, that's revolution." Serafina's voice was steel. "And I'm done asking permission to exist. Get me the dress." 20 minutes later, Serafina stood in front of her mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The gown was midnight blue silk embroidered with silver thread and patterns that caught light like stars. The crown was smaller than the one she'd worn as empress, but still unmistakably imperial, a circlet of white gold set with diamonds that had belonged to Lucien's grandmother. She looked like an empress. She looked like war, dressed in silk. Celeste fastened the final clasp and stepped back, her expression torn between terror and fierce pride. "You're magnificent and completely insane." "I prefer strategically reckless." Serafina tucked the journal of evidence into a concealed pocket in her dress. "If I don't come back from this, make sure my uncle knows where all the documentation is. Make sure the truth survives, even if I don't." "You're coming back." Celeste's voice was absolute. "You survived everything else. You'll survive this." Serafina wasn't so sure, but she nodded anyway. The walk to the council chambers felt like marching toward execution. Servants and nobles pressed against walls as she passed, their expressions shocked and confused. The former empress wearing full regalia, striding through the palace like she still owned it. Guards moved to intercept her, but something about her demeanor made them hesitate. She wasn't sneaking or running. She was walking with absolute authority, daring anyone to stop her. The council chamber doors were sealed, massive oak reinforced with iron, designed to prevent interruption during emergency sessions. 4 guards stood watch, hands on weapons. "The council's in closed session," the senior guard said, his voice uncertain. "Nobody enters without—" "I'm not asking permission." Serafina's voice cut through his objection like a blade. "The Emperor ordered my arrest for sedition. I'm here to face my accusers and present evidence. Unless you plan to drag an unarmed woman away from the doors of justice, you'll let me through." The guards looked at each other, clearly calculating whether physically restraining her would look worse than letting her interrupt. She'd framed it perfectly. Stop her and they were denying her right to defend herself. Let her through and they were disobeying orders. After 5 heartbeats of tense silence, one guard stepped aside. "On your head," he muttered. Serafina pushed the doors open and stepped into chaos. The council chamber was packed with military commanders, nobles, and advisors all shouting at once. Maps of the southern territories covered tables, reports of troop movements scattered across surfaces, and at the center of it all, Lucien stood behind the emperor's chair, looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Every head turned when the doors opened. Every voice went silent when they saw her. Serafina walked down the center aisle in absolute silence, her gown whispering against marble, her crown catching light from 100 candles. She looked like a ghost of empire past haunting empire present. "What is the meaning of this?" Lucian's voice was raw. "Guards! Arrest her immediately!" "For what crime?" General Thorne stood from his seat, his expression cold. "Wearing a dress? Walking through her own palace? Or are we arresting people now just for existing while inconvenient?" She was ordered into exile. Her presence here constitutes defiance of council decree. The exile order gives her 24 hours to depart peacefully. Serafina's voice carried across the chamber with perfect clarity. "I have 17 hours remaining, and I'm using them to present evidence that this council and every person in this room needs to see before making any further decisions about succession or military action." She pulled the journal from her dress and held it up so everyone could see. "This contains documented proof of conspiracy by the Emperor to manufacture evidence against me. Letters detailing bribes paid to council members. Financial records showing imperial funds used to forge medical documents. Testimony and instructions from the Emperor himself about how to systematically destroy my credibility and my family's power." The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in the massive chamber. "That's fabricated evidence planted by traitors," Lucian said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Another desperate attempt by a disgraced empress to avoid consequences. Then let's verify it." General Cade stood, his expression carved from stone. "Right here. Right now. Read the documents aloud in front of all witnesses. If they're fabricated, it'll be obvious. If they're real, we have bigger problems than Southern secession. This is outrageous. I won't submit to... You'll submit or you'll face military tribunal for treason." General Thorne's voice was quiet but absolute. "Those are your options, Your Majesty. Choose." Serafina watched Lucien's face cycle through emotions. Rage, fear, calculation, desperation. He was trapped, and he knew it. Refuse to let the evidence be examined, and he looked guilty. Allow examination and risk complete exposure. "Fine." The word came out like poison. "Read your so-called evidence. Let everyone see how pathetic your fabrications are." Serafina opened the journal and began reading. Letters first. Lucien's handwriting was distinctive and easily verified. Instructions to council member Valerius about voting against her family's interests in exchange for trade contracts. Correspondence with the corrupt physician about timing pregnancy complications to maximum effect. Notes about isolating her from allies systematically. Each document was worse than the last. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of conspiracy so calculated, so methodical, that even nobles who'd been sympathetic to Lucian looked sick. When she reached the financial ledgers showing payments to forge the medical documents, General Cade stood and walked to examine them directly. "These account numbers match Imperial Treasury records," he said flatly. "I've seen enough military budgets to recognize the formatting. This isn't fabricated. This is official documentation of crimes committed using state resources." The chamber erupted. Nobles shouting, military commanders demanding answers, advisors trying desperately to calm the chaos. And through it all, Serafina stood at the center, holding the journal that was destroying an emperor's credibility in real time. Lucian's face had gone white with fury. He looked at Serafina across the chamber, and what lived in his eyes was pure murderous intent. "You've just confessed to stealing imperial documents and conspiring with traitors against the crown. That's treason punishable by execution." His voice was ice. "Guards, arrest the former empress and place her in chains pending trial for crimes against the empire." 20 guards moved forward, surrounding Serafina from all sides. She didn't resist, just stood calmly while they shackled her wrists with iron heavy enough to leave bruises. "Chains won't silence truth," she said quietly, but her voice carried. "You can arrest me, execute me, try to erase me from history. But everyone in this room has seen the evidence now. Everyone knows what you did. And that knowledge doesn't die just because I do. We'll see about that. Lucian's smile was vicious. Take her to the tower. Maximum security. No visitors. No communication with anyone. She's to be tried for treason tomorrow at dawn. The guards began dragging her toward the exit, but General Thorne's voice stopped them. You can't conduct a treason trial without military oversight. That's imperial law when the accused is nobility. His expression was granite. And if you try to execute her without proper procedure, you'll have a full military revolt before the sun sets. Then witness the trial. Watch as I prove she's a traitor and conspirator who's been working to destroy the empire from within. Lucien turned away dismissively. Dawn tomorrow, council chamber. Bring your evidence and your objections. We'll settle this once and for all. Serafina was dragged from the chamber, her dress trailing behind her, her crown sitting crooked from rough handling. The guards weren't gentle. They'd been given permission to treat her as criminal instead of former empress, and they took advantage. By the time they reached the tower, a stone structure built centuries ago for holding political prisoners, her wrists were bleeding from the shackles, and her body ached from being shoved up narrow stairs. They threw her into a cell that was bare stone and iron bars, lit by a single torch that barely penetrated the darkness. The door slammed shut with finality that felt like a coffin lid closing. Serafina sank onto the stone bench that served as a bed and let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She'd done it. Exposed the conspiracy in front of everyone who mattered, forced Lucian to either acknowledge his crimes or double down on tyranny. But she'd also just guaranteed her own execution. There was no way Lucian would let her survive now. Tomorrow's trial would be theater designed to justify killing her legally. She had maybe 12 hours to live. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt strangely calm. She'd done everything possible, fought back harder than anyone expected, refused to go quietly into exile or erasure. If she died tomorrow, at least she'd die knowing she'd made them work for it, that her destruction hadn't been easy or clean or the victory Lucian had planned. There was dignity in that, power in refusing to be complicit in your own erasure. Hours passed in darkness. Serafina dozed occasionally, waking with a start when her body reminded her that stone benches weren't designed for sleeping. Her wrists throbbed where the shackles had cut her skin. Her dress was ruined, the beautiful silk torn and stained. She'd never looked less like an empress and never felt more like one. Sometime near midnight, soft footsteps echoed in the corridor outside her cell. Serafina sat up, squinting into darkness, trying to identify who'd come. A figure materialized at the bars, cloaked and hooded, moving with the kind of stealth that suggested they shouldn't be here. Your Majesty. The voice was male, young, familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. I don't have much time. They'll notice I'm gone soon. The figure pulled back his hood, and Serafina's breath caught. It was one of the guards who'd stepped back during Lucian's attempted arrest in the council chamber. The young idealistic one who'd refused to follow orders he believed were unjust. Why are you here? She asked quietly. Because what's happening to you is wrong. Because I swore an oath to uphold imperial law, and watching you get executed for exposing corruption violates everything that oath stands for. He glanced nervously down the corridor. I can't get you out. The tower is too secure and I'd be killed before we reach the ground level. But I can get a message to people outside the palace. Tell me who to contact and what to say. Serafina's mind raced. One message. One chance to call for help or make final arrangements or maybe, turn tomorrow's execution into something more. General Thorne, tell him the trial tomorrow is a sham designed to justify my execution, and that Lucian plans to use my death as justification for martial law across the empire. Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. Tell him if he wants to prevent tyranny from becoming permanent, he needs to act before dawn. That's asking him to commit treason, to move against the emperor directly. I'm asking him to uphold his oath the same way you're upholding yours. Serafina met the young guard's eyes. Sometimes the law and the emperor's orders aren't the same thing. Sometimes you have to choose which one you actually serve. The guard nodded slowly, understanding settling into his expression. If this goes wrong, if he arrests me for carrying seditious messages, then you'll die knowing you tried to do the right thing. That's more than most people in this palace can say. Serafina's smile was sad. Thank you for being brave when everyone else chose safety. He pulled the hood back up and disappeared into darkness, leaving Serafina alone with her racing thoughts and the weight of what she'd just set in motion. If Thorn acted on her message, if he decided the Emperor had crossed too many lines, tomorrow could be the day the Empire either saved itself or tore itself apart completely. Either way, Serafina wouldn't face execution passively. She'd force them to make the choice explicit, uphold law or embrace tyranny, no middle ground. The remaining hours passed with agonizing slowness. Every sound in the darkness could be guards coming to kill her early, or rescue arriving, or just rats moving through stone corridors. When dawn light finally crept through the single narrow window high in her cell, Serafina felt exhaustion and anticipation in equal measure. Today would end one way or another. Today the Empire would show its true face. Guards arrived to escort her to trial just after sunrise. They removed the heavy shackles and replaced them with lighter chains that allowed her to walk with some dignity. Someone had sent fresh clothes, not imperial regalia this time, but simple dark fabric that made her look like a prisoner instead of an empress. Perfect. Let them see exactly what they were doing to her. The council chamber was even more packed than yesterday. Every noble who could claim standing had crowded in, along with military commanders, foreign ambassadors, and enough witnesses to ensure whatever happened today would be reported across the known world. Lucian sat in the Emperor's chair looking fresh and rested and absolutely certain of victory. Beside him, several council members who'd taken his bribes tried to look impartial, while clearly terrified their own involvement would be exposed. General Thorn sat in the military section, his expression unreadable. If he'd received Serafina's message, he gave no sign. No indication whether he planned to act or if he'd decided defending her wasn't worth the risk. She'd gambled everything on his honor, and she had no idea if the bet would pay off. Lord Chancellor Voss called the session to order, his ancient voice shaking. "We are gathered to address charges of treason against Lady Serafina Vale, former Empress of this realm. The accused stands charged with theft of imperial documents, conspiracy against the crown, and sedition designed to undermine lawful authority." The charges were read in excruciating detail, each one technically true but stripped of context. Yes, she'd stolen documents. Yes, she'd conspired with others. Yes, she'd undermined Lucian's authority. What they didn't mention was that every action had been response to his crimes, that the documents proved conspiracy against her, that undermining corrupt authority was duty, not treason. But legal proceedings weren't about truth. They were about power deciding what truth meant. "How do you plead?" Voss asked, looking at her with something that might have been pity. Serafina stood as straight as her chains allowed and met his eyes without flinching. "Guilty of every charge, and I'd do it again." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Admitting guilt made the verdict automatic, the sentence predetermined. She'd just confessed to crimes punishable by execution. Lucian's smile was triumphant and vicious. "Finally, some honesty from you." He stood, addressing the assembled witnesses with the authority of absolute power. "You've heard her confession. The law is clear. Treason against the crown carries only one sentence: death by execution at sunset today." The words hung in the air like a blade about to fall. Serafina felt her heart hammering but kept her expression calm. This was the moment. Either Thorn would act or she'd spend her last hours preparing to die with whatever dignity she could salvage. General Thorn rose to his feet slowly, and the entire chamber went silent. "I have objections to these proceedings," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "and questions about whether we're witnessing justice or murder dressed in legal ceremony." Lucian's expression darkened. "You overstep, General. This is civilian court, not military tribunal. This is a trial for treason, which requires military oversight when nobility is involved. That's imperial law established 3 centuries ago and never rescinded." Thorn's eyes were cold. "And I'm exercising my authority under that law to challenge this verdict before sentence is carried out." The chamber erupted in chaos. Nobles shouting, council members trying to restore order, military commanders rising to stand with Thorn in visible support. And at the center of it all, Serafina stood chained and exhausted and feeling the first spark of hope she'd allowed herself since yesterday. Thorn hadn't just received her message, he'd decided to act on it. The Empire was about to tear itself apart, and she was standing at the exact point where everything would either collapse or transform into something new. "You're committing treason," Lucian snarled at Thorn, his composure cracking. challenging my authority in open court. I'm upholding imperial law, Thorn interrupted. Something you've consistently failed to do, and I'm not alone. 7 more generals stood, creating a wall of military authority that suddenly made the emperor look very small and very isolated. This trial is suspended pending independent review, Thorn continued. The accused will remain in custody, but no sentence will be carried out until proper legal procedure is followed. Anyone who attempts to execute her before that review concludes will face military charges for murder. Serafina watched Lucian's face as he realized what was happening. He was losing control of the empire in real time, watching his authority crumble because he'd pushed too hard, revealed too much of his willingness to abuse power. This is a coup, Lucien said, his voice shaking with fury. Military overthrow of civilian authority. Barshuri. This is justice, General Cade interrupted, standing to join Thorn. Something you stopped providing the moment you started forging evidence and murdering infants. We're not overthrowing the empire. We're saving it from you. The lines were drawn. Military leadership openly challenging the emperor, nobles frantically calculating which side was safer. The entire empire balanced on a knife's edge between civil war and reformation. And Serafina, chained in the center of it all, finally understood what she'd actually accomplished. She hadn't just exposed one corrupt emperor, she'd forced the entire system to confront whether it would defend law or power when the two came into conflict. The answer to that question would determine everything. Lucien looked at her across the chamber, and his expression promised that whatever happened next, he would make her pay for this humiliation in blood. So be it, he said quietly, voice carrying despite the chaos. If the military wants war, they'll have it, and when I crush this rebellion, every person who stood against me today will learn what happens to traitors. He strode from the chamber with the handful of council members still loyal to him, leaving behind a room full of people who'd just watched the empire fracture. General Thorn approached Serafina, his expression unreadable. You've started something that can't be stopped, he said quietly. Whatever happens next, thousands will die. The empire will be remade or destroyed. Are you prepared for that weight? Serafina met his eyes, feeling the chains on her wrists and the exhaustion in her bones, and the absolute certainty that she'd made the only choice possible. I'm prepared to see it through, she said, whatever it costs, whatever it takes. Thorn nodded slowly, then gestured to guards who moved to remove her chains. Then let's finish what you started, one way or another. The chamber emptied slowly, military commanders and nobles departing to choose sides and prepare for whatever came next. Serafina stood in the center of the massive room, free of chains for the first time in 24 hours, surrounded by the ruins of an empire that had tried to erase her and failed. She'd survived. More than survived. She'd turned her own destruction into a catalyst that would remake everything. But the hardest part was just beginning, because now she had to actually win. The palace became a war zone overnight, not with swords and siege weapons, but with something far more dangerous, competing claims to legitimacy. Lucien controlled the Imperial Guard and half the council. General Thorn commanded military loyalty and the support of nobles who'd grown tired of corruption. And Serafina stood in the middle, the symbol both sides needed but neither fully trusted. She spent the first night after the suspended trial in quarters provided by the military, rooms in the officers' wing that were comfortable but clearly guarded. Protection or imprisonment depending on how optimistic you felt about her chances of survival. Celeste had somehow made it through the chaos to join her, bringing news that was simultaneously hopeful and terrifying. The Southern Territories weren't just threatening secession anymore. They'd formally declared independence under her uncle's leadership, citing the emperor's violations of imperial law as justification. 3 other territorial governors were considering joining them. Foreign powers were watching with predatory interest, ready to exploit the empire's fracture for their own gain. The careful structure that had held the empire together for 3 centuries was coming apart because one woman had refused to accept her own erasure quietly. Serafina stood at the window watching dawn break over the palace grounds, trying to calculate how many people would die because of choices she'd made. The number was too high to process, too abstract to feel real until you started thinking about individual soldiers with families, civilians caught in crossfire, children who'd grow up without parents. Power came with a body count. Nobody told you that when you were a young girl dreaming of changing the world. They talked about responsibility and duty, but never about the weight of knowing people died because you made one choice instead of another. General Thorn arrived as morning light turned the sky pink and gold. He looked like he hadn't slept either, his uniform crisp, but his eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone calculating military logistics against impossible odds. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. The Emperor is mobilizing the Imperial Guard, 5,000 troops loyal to him personally, plus another 2,000 from noble houses who've decided backing the crown is safer than backing reform. His voice was factual, clinical. I have 8,000 soldiers committed to upholding military law over imperial decree. Your uncle commands another 5,000 in the south, but they're 3 days' march from the capital. So we're outnumbered if Lucien attacks before reinforcements arrive. Significantly, and he knows it. Thorn's expression was grim. He's planning to assault the military quarter at sunset, crush the rebellion before it can organize, arrest or execute everyone involved, and restore his authority through overwhelming force. Serafina felt ice flood her veins. How many will die? Thousands. On both sides. This isn't a surgical operation, it's urban warfare in a city packed with civilians. Thorn's jaw was tight, and that's just the first battle. Even if we win, the Empire fractures completely. Civil war that could last years. So why are you telling me this? Why not just surrender and save those lives? Because some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is terrible. Thorn's eyes held something fierce and uncompromising. An empire that allows its emperor to murder infants and forge evidence isn't worth preserving. Better to tear it down and rebuild something honest than let corruption become permanent. The words should have been reassuring, should have validated everything Serafina had fought for. Instead, they just made the weight heavier because Thorn was right, and rightness didn't make the deaths any less real. There might be another way, Serafina said quietly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or suicidal. What if I challenge him directly? Personal combat for the throne, witnessed by both sides. Winner takes imperial authority, loser accepts exile or execution depending on terms. Thorn stared at her like she'd suggested flying to the moon. That's ancient law. It hasn't been invoked in 200 years. Because emperors stopped having their authority challenged. But the law still exists. Serafina's mind was racing now, seeing possibilities. If I invoke trial by combat, Lucien has to accept or admit he's afraid to face me personally. Either way, it reduces the conflict to 2 people instead of 2 armies. You're not a trained soldier. He'd kill you in minutes. Maybe, or maybe I'd get lucky. Or maybe just forcing him to fight me personally instead of hiding behind armies would expose something about his character that changes how people see him. Serafina turned from the window to face Thorn directly. Either way, it's better than thousands dying in a battle where victory just means more battles later. This is insane. I can't let you... You can't stop me. I'm invoking ancient imperial law that supersedes military authority. Her voice was steady despite the terror creeping up her spine. Send word to Lucien. Tell him I challenge his claim to the throne through personal combat. Sunset today in the Grand Courtyard. Witnessed by representatives from both sides and binding under law. Thorn looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe. Or recognition that she'd become something different from the gentle empress who'd started this journey. If you die, this was all for nothing. The reforms, the exposure of corruption, everything you fought for. It dies with you. No, it doesn't. The truth is already spreading. The Empire already knows what he did. Serafina's smile was bitter. My death just makes me a martyr instead of a survivor. Sometimes martyrs are more useful than heroes anyway. After Thorn left to deliver the challenge, Serafina sat alone with the magnitude of what she'd just committed to. She'd spent 7 years avoiding confrontation, trying to earn love through compliance and sacrifice. And now she was volunteering to fight the most powerful man in the Empire in single combat with her life as the wager. The woman she'd been a week ago would never have made this choice. Would have found some way to compromise, to smooth over conflict, to sacrifice herself quietly if it meant preserving peace. That woman was dead. What remained was someone who'd learned that some prices were too high to pay, that survival without dignity was just slower dying, that sometimes you had to risk everything to prove you were willing to risk anything. She spent the day preparing, not training. There wasn't enough time to become a warrior in a few hours, but centering herself, accepting what was about to happen, making peace with the strong possibility she wouldn't survive past sunset. Celeste helped her dress in simple fighting leathers provided by the military. No elaborate gown this time, no crown or jewelry, just practical clothing that allowed movement and wouldn't get tangled in combat. The older woman's hand shook as she fastened straps and buckles. "This is my fault," Celeste whispered. "I pushed you toward confrontation, told you to fight back. And now you're going to die because I made you believe survival was worth this price. You didn't make me believe anything. You just helped me remember who I actually was under all the conditioning." Serafina caught Celeste's hands, stilling them. "And if I die tonight, I die knowing I tried. That's more than I'd have if I'd just accepted exile and spent the rest of my life wondering if I could have changed things. You changed everything already. You don't have to prove anything else. I'm not proving anything. I'm finishing what I started." Serafina's voice was calm despite the fear churning in her stomach. "And maybe teaching the Empire one final lesson about what happens when you underestimate women who've got nothing left to lose." The walk to the grand courtyard felt like the longest journey of her life. Crowds had gathered despite the danger. Nobles, soldiers, servants, citizens who'd somehow heard about the challenge and came to witness history. They lined corridors and filled balconies, creating a gauntlet of watching eyes that Serafina had to walk through to reach the combat ground. The grand courtyard was massive, a circular space of packed dirt surrounded by stone walls where tournaments had been held in the old days before entertainment became more civilized. Now it was being repurposed for something far more primal. Two people fighting for the right to rule an empire. Lucien was already waiting when she arrived. He dressed in full imperial regalia, crimson and gold, ceremonial sword at his hip that was definitely not ceremonial given how many battles he'd fought before becoming emperor. He looked like power incarnate, like destiny manifested in human form. Serafina looked like a woman in borrowed leathers who'd barely slept in a week. The contrast was almost comedic if you ignored the fact that one of them would probably die in the next hour. Lord Chancellor Voss stood at the center of the courtyard looking ancient and exhausted. He'd been chosen as neutral arbiter, one of the few people both sides still marginally trusted. "This challenge has been issued under ancient imperial law," he announced, his voice carrying across the packed courtyard. "Combat to determine rightful authority. The terms are absolute. Winner claims the throne, loser accepts death, or exile as the victor decrees. There will be no interference once combat begins, no mercy except what the winner grants." He looked at both of them, his expression heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. "Do you both accept these terms freely and without coercion?" "I accept," Lucien said, his voice carrying absolute confidence. "And I promise to be merciful in victory. Death will be quick." "How generous!" Serafina's voice was dry. "I accept the terms. And I promise nothing except that you'll have to actually kill me instead of having others do it for you." Something flickered across Lucien's face, anger or recognition that she was right. He'd spent 7 years using intermediaries and conspiracies instead of confronting her directly. Now he'd have to actually look her in the eye while destroying her. Voss retreated to the edge of the courtyard, and the crowd went silent. 2,000 people holding their breath, waiting to see how this ended. Lucien drew his sword, long blade that caught sunset light like liquid fire. Serafina drew the weapon she'd been given, shorter, lighter, designed for someone who relied on speed over strength. They circled each other slowly, and Serafina felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd watched enough training exercises to know basic technique, but watching and doing were entirely different when the blade coming at you was real and aimed to kill. Lucien struck first, a testing blow. Not committed, but fast enough to gauge her reactions. Serafina barely got her sword up in time, the impact vibrating through her arms hard enough to hurt. He was stronger, faster, better trained in every measurable way. She was going to die here, and part of her had always known it. But she'd die standing, die fighting, die proving that she'd rather bleed in the dirt than accept his version of mercy. Lucien pressed the attack, his strikes coming faster now that he'd confirmed she was no real threat. Serafina blocked desperately, giving ground, her arms screaming from the impact of blade meeting blade. "You were always too weak for this world," Lucien said between strikes, his voice almost conversational. "Too soft, too desperate to be loved. I tried to make you understand that power requires hardness, requires willingness to do terrible things for necessary ends." "You're confusing hardness with cruelty," Serafina gasped, dodging a strike that would have opened her throat. "They're not the same thing." aren't they? Another strike, this one scoring across her shoulder and drawing first blood. You became cruel in the end anyway. Started a war that'll kill thousands. Destroyed an empire because you couldn't accept being replaced. How is that different from what I did? The words hit harder than the blade. Because he was right in some terrible way, she had started this conflict, had chosen confrontation over compromise, had decided her personal vindication was worth the price in blood. But there was a difference. Had to be a difference. I fought back against injustice, she said, her voice shaking. You created it. That's the difference. That's everything. Keep telling yourself that while you bleed out. Lucian's next strike came fast and brutal, slamming her sword aside and leaving her completely open. Serafina saw the killing blow coming, saw his blade aimed at her chest, saw the triumph in his eyes as he prepared to end this. And something inside her simply refused. She couldn't beat him with strength or skill or training, but she could refuse to die conveniently, could refuse to make it easy. Instead of trying to block, she dropped completely, hitting the ground and rolling beneath his strike. Her shorter blade came up in a desperate slash that caught him across the thigh. Not deep, not fatal, but unexpected enough that he stumbled back, surprise replacing confidence on his face. Serafina scrambled to her feet, her shoulder bleeding and her body screaming, but her mind crystallizing around a simple truth. She didn't have to win. She just had to survive long enough to change the story being told in this courtyard. Lucian attacked again, angrier now, his strikes coming harder but less controlled. She gave ground continuously, blocking when she could and dodging when she couldn't, taking cuts and bruises but staying alive through pure stubborn refusal to die on his schedule. Minutes stretched like hours. Her vision was narrowing from blood loss and exhaustion. Her arms felt like lead. Every breath tasted like copper. But she was still standing, still fighting, still proving that destroying her required effort. Just die already, Lucian snarled, frustration cracking his composure. Stop dragging this out. No. The word came out bloody, but absolute. You want me dead? Earn it. Kill me yourself instead of hiring conspirators. Face what you're doing instead of hiding behind justifications. She saw it then. The flicker of something in his eyes that might have been shame or recognition or just exhaustion. The acknowledgement that she was right, that he'd spent years avoiding direct confrontation, that even now with victory guaranteed he was struggling to actually deliver the killing blow. Because somewhere under all the ambition and corruption, he remembered the man he'd been before power twisted him into something else. And that man had loved her once, however imperfectly. Killing her face to face meant killing that last piece of humanity. His next strike came slower, still deadly, still aimed to kill, but carrying weight beyond physical force, the weight of choosing who he wanted to be, the emperor who'd sacrifice anything for power, or the man who'd once believed in something better. Serafina blocked desperately, her strength failing, her sword slipping in blood-slicked hands. She couldn't hold out much longer, seconds maybe, a minute at most. And then what? She'd proven her point, forced him to face her directly, but she'd still die. The reforms would still be uncertain. The empire would still be fractured, unless she changed the game one final time. I yield, Serafina said quietly, lowering her sword. The courtyard erupted in shocked murmurs. Lucian froze mid-strike, his blade inches from her neck, confusion replacing battle focus. What are you doing? Yielding, accepting exile on one condition. Serafina's voice carried across the silent courtyard. You submit to independent investigation of your crimes, real investigation by military tribunal, not council members you've bribed. You face justice for forging evidence and murdering my daughter. And if you're found guilty, you accept punishment under law. That's insane. I won. You don't get to dictate terms. Then kill me. Right now. In front of everyone. Serafina met his eyes without flinching. Show the Empire exactly what you're willing to do to avoid accountability. Prove that might makes right, and law means nothing when it threatens imperial power. The silence was absolute. 2,000 people watching, waiting to see what he'd choose. The Emperor who'd won through superior skill being offered terms by the woman he'd defeated. Accept accountability or commit obvious murder. Those were his options. Lucian's face cycled through emotions. Rage, frustration, calculation. His sword was still raised, still ready to strike. One movement, and this ended with her death. But everyone was watching, and killing her now after she'd yielded would make him look exactly like the tyrant she'd accused him of being. "You're trying to manipulate me," he said quietly. "Force my hand through public pressure. I'm offering you a chance at redemption." Serafina's voice was steady despite the blood loss making her dizzy. "Face justice. Accept consequences. Show the Empire that even emperors aren't above the law. That's not weakness, that's strength. Real strength that doesn't require murdering the people who challenge you." She watched something shift in his expression, some internal calculation that went beyond tactics or victory. A decision about who he wanted to be when this moment became history. Finally, slowly, he lowered his sword. "I accept independent investigation. Military tribunal with neutral arbiters." His voice was rough. "If I'm found guilty, I'll accept punishment under law. No immunity, no exceptions." The courtyard erupted, nobles shouting, soldiers cheering or protesting depending on their loyalties. The entire empire watching its structure reshape in real time. Serafina felt her legs give out, exhaustion and blood loss finally catching up with her. She hit the ground hard, vision swimming, barely aware of Celeste and military physicians rushing toward her. She'd done it, changed the game one final time, turned her own defeat into a framework for accountability. Whether it would work, whether Lucien would actually follow through or find ways to corrupt the investigation, that remained to be seen. But she'd created the possibility, forced the Empire to confront whether law meant anything when applied to the powerful. That was enough. Had to be enough. Everything went dark. Serafina woke 3 days later in the military medical ward, her body wrapped in bandages and her mind foggy from whatever drugs they'd given her for pain. Celeste was there immediately, gripping her hand like she'd disappear if contact was broken. "You scared me half to death," the older woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "You lost so much blood. The physicians weren't sure you'd survive." "I'm stubborn," Serafina's voice came out raspy. "What happened? Did he honor the terms?" "He did. The investigation started yesterday. Military tribunal with 3 neutral arbiters, one from the Northern Territories, one from the merchant guilds, one from the military justice system." Celeste's expression was carefully neutral. "They're examining all the evidence, interviewing witnesses. It's been brutal." "And Lucien?" "Cooperating, submitting to questioning, looking more human than I've seen him in years." Celeste paused. "Merida testified yesterday. She survived the hemorrhaging, barely, and she's keeping her promise. Told them everything, the conspiracy, the bribes, her own involvement. She's accepting charges as accomplice." Serafina processed that slowly, trying to reconcile the Merida who'd betrayed her with the woman who was now testifying honestly, knowing it meant her own destruction. People were complicated, capable of terrible choices and genuine redemption in equal measure. That was either hopeful or depressing depending on your perspective. What about the Southern Territories? Your uncle's waiting to see how the investigation concludes. If Lucien's actually held accountable, he'll consider rejoining the Empire under reformed governance. If it's another cover-up, the secession becomes permanent. Celeste's grip tightened. Everything balances on whether this investigation is real or just theater. So the Empire's future depended on whether people chose truth over convenience, whether accountability mattered more than stability, whether justice was possible when applied to the powerful. Serafina closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it settling over her again. She'd started this avalanche, but she couldn't control where it landed. All she could do was heal and hope that something better grew from the ruins. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. Serafina followed it from her medical bed, reading transcripts that Celeste brought daily, watching the Empire dissect its own corruption in excruciating detail. The evidence was overwhelming. Letters in Lucien's handwriting detailing conspiracies, financial records showing bribes, testimony from palace servants and corrupt officials who'd participated in the plot, medical documentation proving her pregnancies had been sabotaged. The tribunal laid it all bare in proceedings that were broadcast across the Empire. No backroom deals, no sealed testimony. Everything public, everything witnessed, every crime exposed to sunlight that should have disinfected, should have. But corruption had deep roots, and exposure didn't guarantee consequences. On the final day of the investigation, Serafina was strong enough to attend the verdict in person. She walked into the council chamber leaning on Celeste's arm, her body still healing from wounds that would probably leave scars. physical reminders of the price she'd paid for refusing to stay silent. The chamber was packed again, but the atmosphere felt different this time. Heavier. Like everyone understood they were witnessing something that would define the empire for generations. The three arbiters sat at the high table, their expressions grave. Lucien stood before them stripped of imperial regalia, wearing simple clothes that made him look less like an emperor and more like what he actually was, a man who'd made terrible choices and was finally facing consequences. The head arbiter, a northern general named Castellane, spoke with the weight of absolute authority. After 3 weeks of investigation and testimony from 147 witnesses, this tribunal finds Emperor Lucien Draven guilty of conspiracy to defraud imperial courts, guilty of bribery and corruption of public officials, guilty of assault resulting in the death of an unborn child, and guilty of abuse of imperial power for personal gain. The words hung in the air like an execution order. The law is clear. These crimes carry sentences ranging from exile to execution depending on severity and circumstances. However, this tribunal recognizes that the accused has cooperated fully with investigation, has shown genuine remorse for actions committed, and has demonstrated willingness to submit to justice rather than resist through force. Castellane's eyes were cold but fair. Therefore, we render the following judgment. Lucien Draven is stripped of imperial title and all associated powers effective immediately. He is sentenced to 10 years supervised service rebuilding infrastructure in the territories most damaged by his policies. He will live as common citizen, subject to the same laws as all others, with no immunity or special treatment. At the end of 10 years, his sentence will be reviewed and either extended or concluded based on conduct. Not execution, not even permanent exile, but not immunity either. Accountability with the possibility of eventual redemption. It was more than Serafina had dared hope for, less than many had demanded. Exactly the kind of complicated justice that acknowledged both crime and humanity. Lucien's face was unreadable as he listened to his sentence. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. I accept the judgment and the terms. I'll serve the sentence fully and without complaint. He paused, then turned to look directly at Serafina. I owe many people apologies, but I owe you something more. An acknowledgement that everything you accused me of was true, that I became exactly the kind of tyrant I once swore to prevent, that you were right to fight back even when it cost you everything. The chamber was silent, everyone holding their breath. I'm sorry, Lucien said, and the words carried weight of genuine remorse. For the lies, the betrayals, the cruelty, for murdering our daughter, for trying to erase you instead of accepting that you'd outgrown the role I needed you to play. I'm sorry for becoming someone who chose power over humanity, over you. Serafina felt something crack open inside her chest. Not forgiveness, that would take years if it came at all. But recognition that the man who'd hurt her was actually capable of seeing what he'd done, of choosing accountability over ego. It didn't undo the damage, didn't resurrect her lost children, or give her back the years she'd spent being systematically destroyed. But it was something. A starting point for the long work of rebuilding herself and maybe, eventually, forgiving the man he'd been without forgetting what he'd done. I accept your apology, Serafina said quietly, and I hope you find redemption in the service you'll perform. But that forgiveness, that's something you'll have to earn over time, if you earn it at all. Lucien nodded slowly, accepting the terms the same way he'd accepted the sentence. Then guards led him away to begin his new life as common citizen, paying debts to the empire he'd nearly destroyed. After the council chamber emptied, General Thorne approached Serafina with an expression that was carefully neutral. The High Council has asked me to present you with a proposal. The empire needs leadership during this transition period. Someone who understands both the corruption we're dismantling and the reforms we're implementing. He paused. They want to offer you the position of Regent Empress until new governance structures can be established. Serafina felt her stomach drop. I'm the woman who started a civil war and nearly tore the empire apart. You're the woman who exposed corruption and forced accountability when everyone else was too comfortable or too frightened to act. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need right now. Thorne's expression was earnest. You don't have to accept. You've already paid enough. But if you're willing to help rebuild what you helped tear down, the empire could benefit from your perspective. The offer was tempting in ways Serafina hadn't expected. A chance to shape the reforms, to ensure her fight hadn't been for nothing, to transform the empire into something actually worth serving. But it was also a trap. Power offered to someone who'd just proven how dangerous she could be when cornered. An opportunity that could easily corrupt her the same way it had corrupted Lucien if she wasn't careful. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "I need to heal, physically and otherwise. To figure out who I am now that I'm not fighting for survival every single day. Take all the time you need. The offer stands." Thorne nodded respectfully, then left her alone with Celeste and the massive decision weighing on her shoulders. That night, Seraphina stood on a balcony overlooking the palace grounds where this entire nightmare had started. The grand hall where she'd been humiliated was dark and quiet now, the celebrations and conspiracies replaced by uncertain peace. She thought about the woman she'd been a month ago, desperate to be loved, willing to sacrifice anything for approval, convinced her worth was measured by how well she served others. That woman was dead, killed by betrayal and reborn through fire into someone harder, colder, more willing to fight than compromise. But maybe there was space between those extremes. Maybe she didn't have to choose between doormat and destroyer. Maybe real strength was knowing when to fight and when to heal, when to demand justice and when to offer mercy. The Empire had given her a chance at redemption just like it had given Lucien. Whether she took it, whether she could lead without becoming what she'd fought against, that was the real test. Not whether she could survive being destroyed, but whether she could survive victory without losing the parts of herself worth saving. Celeste joined her on the balcony, wrapping a shawl around Seraphina's shoulders against the evening chill. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything. Nothing. Whether I'm strong enough to lead without becoming a tyrant myself." Seraphina's laugh was soft and slightly bitter. "Whether any of us are strong enough for power, or if it always corrupts eventually." "Power doesn't corrupt. It reveals." Celeste's voice was certain. "It shows who people really are when consequences don't apply. You've already been tested under those conditions and chose accountability over convenience. That's not a guarantee you'll never make mistakes, but it's a decent indication you won't become Lucien."